On December 7th, 1979, it was finally happening. After 10 years since the cancellation of the TV show, Star Trek was returning to the big screen with all of our favorite heroes. William Shatner as Captain James T. Kirk, or rather Admiral James T. Kirk, Leonard Nimoy as Spock, DeForest Kelley as Dr. Leonard McCoy, Uhura, Sulu, Chekhov, Scotty. They were all reuniting on the big screen. In this video, we're going to talk about the incredible effort to bring this movie to the big screen and how perilous the making of this film actually was. From crazy deadlines, to botched special effects, to an incomplete script, everything that could go wrong seemed to have gone wrong. So join me as we talk about the fascinating making of Star Trek the Motion Picture and what it took to get this film onto the big screen. The original Star Trek series is canceled in 1969 in only its third season. A furious letter-writing campaign begins, and it isn't enough to save the show. The cast and crew that were associated with the show thought they had a good run, but decided to go their separate ways. However, something extraordinary happened. Star Trek became a huge hit in syndication. Paramount decided to make money off of Star Trek by selling the 79 episodes to various small broadcasting companies. One of the small broadcasting companies that purchased the syndication rights to Star Trek was a small company named Kaiser Broadcasting, which was broadcasting on the UHF frequency in cities like Boston, Philadelphia, Cleveland, and Detroit. He was one of the first to pioneer the airing of Star Trek at a great time slot. The owner of Kaiser was a huge Star Trek fan, and he began to air the Star Trek episodes at the 6 p.m. slot as counter-programming to network news. It was brilliant, and Kaiser Broadcasting had a huge hit on its hands with Star Trek reruns. Soon, other broadcasting companies followed suit and purchased syndication rights from Paramount. And in 1971, Star Trek was playing all across the country. Star Trek reruns were very popular, and millions of new fans who never saw Star Trek in its original airing became huge Star Trek fans through the reruns. On January 21, 1972, the world saw the rise of the first Star Trek convention. It was held at the Statler Inn Hilton in New York City, where over 3,000 fans met to discuss Star Trek. Gene Roddenberry and his wife Majel Barrett were guests along with series writer D.C. Fontana. Soon, Star Trek conventions were popping up everywhere in every city. And in 1972, Paramount released a new Star Trek series in the form of animation. Featured the voices of the original cast, William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy, DeForest Kelley, George Takei, and Nichelle Nichols, and used stories that were unused in the original series. It ran for 22 episodes and even won an Emmy in 1975 for Outstanding Entertainment in Children's Television. Today, Star Trek the Animated Series is highly regarded as a worthy low-budget follow-up to the original series. Star Trek mania had begun, and nothing signals success than merchandising. Paramount began merchandising Star Trek toys with various degrees of success. By far the most successful and memorable were the action figures by Mego Toys, released in 1974. These were 8-inch action figures dressed in cloth clothing. They even sold an Enterprise bridge with a transporter. In 1976, during Gerald Ford's presidency, NASA was going to launch a space shuttle named the Constitution. 400,000 Star Trek fans wrote into the White House, asked that the name of the shuttle be changed to the Enterprise, and the Ford administration did it. They talked to NASA, and in 1976, the shuttle was rechristened the Enterprise. As early as 1975, Gene Roddenberry wanted to revive Star Trek. He pitched a screenplay called The God Thing, where a massive, giant entity is headed for Earth, and the Enterprise is sent to intercept it. However, the entity turns out not to be God, but an artificial life intelligence from deep space. You can see how this concept would later influence the motion picture. However, executives at Paramount were not happy with this idea and worried about the potential controversy. Paramount enlisted many writers, including Harlan Ellison, to pitch story ideas. Charles Bryant and Alan Scott pitched a story called Star Trek Planet of the Titans, and even got director Philip Kaufman attached. The story had the Enterprise falling into a black hole and emerging hundreds of thousands of years into Earth's past. There, they would teach early man how to create fire, and people attached described the film as psychedelic in the vein of 2001, A Space Odyssey. However, Paramount canceled the project in early 1976. In April 1978, Paramount Television announced a bold new plan to create a television network that would challenge the big three TV networks It would be called Paramount Television Service. Paramount was quite serious about this and wanted a new Star Trek TV series that would be the flagship of this network. In June 17, 1977, Paramount Television announced that it was launching a new TV series called Star Trek Phase 2. Phase 2 would simply be the continuing adventures of the USS Enterprise, the second 5-year mission. Legendary writer Alan Dean Foster wrote the pilot episode called In Thy Image, where a massive godlike entity heads toward Earth looking for its creator, Ensa, and the Enterprise will be sent to intercept it. In the end, this massive being would turn out to be a long-lost probe that found a machine planet who gave it a massive body, and Kirk would clean off the sign which would reveal a missing A, revealing that the probe came from NASA. You can see how this idea influenced the idea of Voyager being the Voyager probe. Writer Harold Livingston was hired as head screenwriter to turn Alan Dean Foster's story into a working screenplay. Production began, and 13 episodes were scripted. The actors from McCoy, Scotty, Uhura, Sulu, and Chekhov all returned. William Shatner was expected to return, but Paramount expected a tough negotiation. He was the only actor who had a successful career, and therefore he had some Hollywood cachet to throw around. The producers created a Kirk-like commander named Will Decker, who could easily step into Captain Kirk's chair in case William Shatner's negotiations did not go well and he demanded too much money. Leonard Nimoy refused to return as Spock over his dispute with Paramount over the use of his image in advertising. In 1976, Heineken released an ad where Spock's ears are droopy, but when he drinks a beer, they perk up. Nimoy did not approve this, earned no money from it, and found the ad offensive and demeaning. He tried to sue the advertising agency, leading to a prolonged dispute with Paramount. He was unlikely to return. Paramount created a new Vulcan character named Zahn, played by David Gattro, and Zahn was a Vulcan who admired humans and volunteered to serve in Starfleet in order to learn about human emotions to become more like them. A third new character, Lieutenant Ilia, rounded up the new cast. Ilia was a psychic empath from the planet Delta who had a pre-existing relationship with Commander Decker. For the role of Ilia, they cast Persis Khambatta, who was a supermodel and Miss India in 1965 and had been in a couple of movies. It was Gene Roddenberry's idea to make Ilia bald in order to outline her alien identity. However, many on the production felt that this was the wrong call and was baffled as to why they did it. They felt that when you have someone as beautiful as Persis Khambatta, you want to use her to your advantage to add some sex appeal to the movie, not dampen the movie's assets by cutting off all her hair. Persis Khambatta was born to a middle-class family in Bombay, India, and when she was a child, Persis gained fame at the age of 13 when a casually taken photograph of her was used in a popular soap advertisement for Rexona. When she was 16, she entered the 1965 Miss India and won, and she represented India in the Miss Universe contest, but did not place. At age 20, she made her Bollywood debut in a 1968 Indian film, and in 1975, at age 27, she got roles in British films, Conduct Unbecoming, starring Michael York, Richard Attenborough, and Stacy Keach, as well as The Wilby Conspiracy, starring Michael Caine, Sidney Poitier, and Nicole Williamson. And in 1977, she was hired as the bald Delta Lieutenant Ilia for the new proposed Star Trek Phase 2 television show, which we now know became Star Trek the Motion Picture. And her co-stars described her as a kind and gentle person who was a little overwhelmed by Hollywood. And after Star Trek, this was to be her big break, but her movie star career never really materialized. After Star Trek, she starred in a few B movies and even auditioned for the role of Octopussy, but lost it to Maud Adams. In 1985, she returned back to India, and in 1987, she married Indian-British field hockey player Ray Saldana and continued to have occasional bit parts on television. Her final role was in the 1993 pilot episode of Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman. On 18th of August 1988, Persis Khambatta, who was a chain smoker, began to have chest pains and was taken to the hospital in Mumbai, where she died of a massive heart attack at the tragically young age of 49. A decade later, Gene Roddenberry will use Decker, Ilia, and Zahn and transfer their characters into the character of William Riker, Deanna Troi, and Data. Riker is a Kirk-like chief commanding officer, while Troi is a psychic empath from the planet Beta Z who had a pre-existing relationship with Riker. Data would be an android devoid of human emotions who hopes to become more human. You can see the similarities. Star Trek Phase 2 was ready to go. until something very unexpected happened in 1977. Star Wars had been released earlier that year, and Paramount executives dismissed it as a fad. However, by fall of 1977, Star Wars had become a genuine sensation and could not be ignored. That convinced Paramount Studios that science fiction was where the money was, and the success of Star Wars, Paramount called in all their top executives to a big meeting to demand ideas on how to cash in on this Star Wars phenomenon. They ordered their top guys to create a similar Star Wars-like franchise, and one of the producers raised their hands and reminded the executive that Paramount already owned a Star Wars-like franchise called Star Trek. Immediately, Star Trek Phase 2, the TV show, was canceled. And 2 weeks later, an official high-budget Star Trek feature film was greenlit. Gene Roddenberry was made producer, and many people from Star Trek Phase 2 were brought over to work on this feature film. So we need to talk about Gene Roddenberry's complicated character. Back during the days before Star Trek the original series, Gene Roddenberry was known as a kind and gentle and brilliant man who had a lot of insecurities, and at that time his insecurities made him more sympathetic and endearing. However, we all know what can happen to insecure people who suddenly become successful and get a little power. After Star Trek got on the air and Roddenberry began to get accolades, and he was referred to as the great bird of the galaxy, people began to see him start to get a little bit of a sense of himself. And people that worked with him said that he was not as thoughtful and introspective about it as one would have hoped. It was here that he began to get into conflicts with the cast and the producers. He was still a visionary and brilliant storyteller, but he was also described as a very mediocre writer. He relied heavily on his scriptwriters like D.C. Fontana to turn his vision into that 60 to 70 page teleplay. And Gene Roddenberry knew absolutely nothing about the practical day-to-day operations of filming a TV show or a movie. Now, by the time Star Trek the Motion Picture was filming, Gene Roddenberry was reveling in his own reputation and success. To Gene, he was the great bird of the galaxy, and no one could tell him otherwise. He would frequently get into conflicts with other filmmakers, especially other screenwriters, and he became very unmanageable. It was his way or the highway, and people who worked with him described him as being very difficult to work with. He was still generous and magnanimous toward his legions of fans, but if you were a working colleague, it was very different. According to people who had worked with him, whenever he met someone new in Hollywood, it was as if he'd look for a reason to get in an argument with them. You were either an adoring fan or you were the enemy. There was really no middle ground. For director, they hired legendary Academy Award-winning director Robert Wise. This was an odd choice because Robert Wise was not a Star Trek fan, and he was completely unfamiliar with the TV show. Despite this, Robert Wise was considered a very safe director to helm this project. So why Robert Wise? Why did Paramount choose a man who was not a Star Trek fan and more associated with movies like The West Side Story and The Sound of Music? Well, this is because Paramount began to see what they called the Gene Roddenberry problem. After all, Gene Roddenberry created Star Trek and had a legion of fans who adored him. And Gene Roddenberry had very strong ideas about what Star Trek was and what it should be. However, Gene Roddenberry had very little idea how a Hollywood film gets made, the practical, everyday, day-to-day production of a big blockbuster feature. But Roddenberry would often insert himself and attempt to exert control over the production. So from Paramount's point of view, he was often the problem getting in the way of the movie's production. However, Gene Roddenberry had a favorite science fiction movie, and his favorite movie of all time was The Day the Earth Stood Still, directed by Robert Wise. Paramount hoped that by hiring his idol to direct Star Trek, and that would be a way of controlling Roddenberry and stop him from interfering with the production. And it worked, at least in the beginning of the production. Robert Wise was born in Winchester, Indiana, to a poor family, and his favorite childhood pastime was going to the movies. In high school, he wrote humor and sports columns for the school newspaper, and he went to Franklin College on scholarship, but had to drop out in his sophomore year due to his family's poor financial situation, so he and his brother moved to Hollywood, California to get jobs for RKO. Robert Wise worked in the shipping department and then worked odd jobs around the studio for 2 years until he was finally hired as sound and music editor. He literally started in the mailroom and worked himself up the studio. In 1936, he became the assistant to the film editor, William Hamilton, and got to work on real Hollywood films for the next 5 years. And in 1941, he was hired by Orson Welles as editor on Citizen Kane, for which he won an Academy Award for film editing. He soon moved to directing movies, dozens of movies, and in 1951, he directed The Day the Earth Stood Still, and by the time he directed the 1961 The West Side Story, he had already directed 27 Hollywood movies. And he would go on to direct the 1965 Sound of Music and the 1971 Andromeda Strain. He was very well respected in Hollywood as an effective director who understood the craft of filmmaking as well as the business side of the movie-making process, but still understood the art of movies and could make artistic movies that both critics and audiences loved. Wise was hired and given a budget of $16 million, but spoiler alert, this is going to get a lot higher. But Robert Wise was not a Star Trek fan, but his wife, his daughter, and his son-in-law were huge fans. When his wife read the script, she first asked, "Where's Spock?" Wise explained that Leonard Nimoy was not returning, and she said, "Without Spock, there is no Star Trek." And what really impressed Robert Wise was how vehemently his daughter and son-in-law agreed. And Robert Wise realized that they needed Leonard Nimoy. He had Paramount settle their disputes with Leonard Nimoy, pay him what he was asking for, and signed him for the movie. Unfortunately for David Gattro, this meant that Zahn was out. When Leonard Nimoy initially refused to reprise the role of Spock for Star Trek Phase 2, Gene Roddenberry created the character of Zahn, who was a full-blooded Vulcan in Starfleet. However, unlike Spock, who endeavored to be more Vulcan, Zahn was fascinated with humans and wanted to learn more about human emotions. And David Gattro was hired for the role of Zahn. Unfortunately, fans did not take to Zahn, or rather, were probably just upset that Spock would not be in Star Trek Phase 2 and took it out on poor David Gattro. But fans were not kind about it. He even received letters threatening to poison him if he didn't quit. So yeah, that really happened. When Robert Wise was brought on to direct and advocated for the hiring of Leonard Nimoy, Gene Roddenberry continued to advocate for David Gattro to play Zahn over Leonard Nimoy's Spock. And at one point, while Paramount was negotiating with Leonard Nimoy, Gene Roddenberry had a conversation with David Gattro, assuring him not to worry, that the role of Zahn was guaranteed, and that Paramount still wanted him over Leonard Nimoy. But then a few days later, Paramount settled their dispute with Nimoy, and Gattro was out. However, they were able to give Gattro a small role as Commander Branch, head of Space Station Epsilon 9, the one that gets destroyed by V'ger at the beginning of the movie. During this time, Leonard Nimoy approached David Gattro and had a frank conversation about him replacing Zahn and helped David Gattro process the loss of the role. David Gattro thought it was a very kind gesture and very wise of Leonard Nimoy to do something like that, and always appreciated it. Fortunately, David Gattro has had a very successful career as a character actor in Hollywood and has had parts in T.J. Hooker, The Fall Guy, L.A. Law, ER, Boston Legal, and The New Hawaii Five-0, NCIS, and The Goldbergs, and continues to work today at the age of 73. Paramount had pre-sold theater tickets for the price of $30 million for December 7, 1979, which was 18 months away. Paramount demanded the film be completed by this date, or the theaters could sue Paramount. Robert Wise continued to request Paramount push back the date, but it was too late. Paramount always refused. This hard-stop premiere date of December 7, 1979 hung over the production's heads like a ticking time bomb. Paramount wanted to have special effects that could rival Star Wars, and they first went to Douglas Trumbull. Trumbull had a great reputation in Hollywood, and he had just done the special effects for 2001: A Space Odyssey and was known as the best special effects guy in Hollywood. Paramount went to Douglas Trumbull and offered him the job of Star Trek: The Motion Picture. However, he declined because he wanted to do his own project. So Paramount needed to hire a special effects company. They accepted bids from various special effects companies all over town, and a production company called Abel & Associates, headed by Robert Abel, won the bid with the offer of $4 million. Robert Abel was known mostly for being a documentary filmmaker. However, he sold himself to Paramount as a special effects company. This decision to use Abel & Associates is going to haunt Robert Wise for months, but we'll talk about that in a moment. For the sets, many of them were already built for Star Trek Phase 2. However, that was built for a television show, not a feature film. Robert Wise wanted larger sets to convey the reality of what a huge starship would look like in the future. The USS Enterprise had to be redesigned for the big screen. The production crew was given a budget of $150,000 to redesign and create the new starship. The model was 8 foot long, and the larger size allowed many more details, and the warp nacelles would look sleeker, and it was also made with a lightweight aluminum, so the entire model only weighed 85 pounds. With the television Enterprise, the dorsal neck supports would weaken and shake. This time, they were reinforced with strong aluminum, which allowed the 8-foot model to be very sturdy and allowed movement without any weakening. Everyone was very pleased with the new Enterprise, and it was an amazing design. The character of Will Dacre remained uncast, so Robert Wise auditioned many actors, and Stephen Collins clearly stood out. He was not a Star Trek fan, so he was not intimidated by the character and was able to convey a strong leading man confidence. Stephen Collins was born in Des Moines, Iowa, and graduated Amherst College. After graduating, he pursued acting and found small roles as a character actor on shows like The Waltons and Charlie's Angels. Star Trek the Motion Picture was his big break. And after Star Trek, he had prominent roles in movies like Brewster's Millions, Jumping Jack Flash, and Stella. But his most notable role was as the patriarch, Reverend Eric Camden, on 11 seasons of Seventh Heaven, co-starring Star Trek IV's Catherine Hicks. And on the show, he played a decent, religious, benevolent, and heroic man. Well, on October of 2014, Collins was recorded secretly during a therapy session without Collins nor the therapist being aware that they were being recorded. And on that recording, Collins admitted to a past romantic encounter with a 14-year-old minor. Although it was not known how long ago it was assumed that it was over 20 or 30 years ago. And this was a huge scandal, and the Los Angeles Police Department got involved but could not find any substantiating evidence. Then Stephen Collins, who was 67 years old in 2014, in an interview with People magazine, admitted to 3 inappropriate encounters with underage girls, once in 1973, in 1982, and in 1994, and one of the girls was 11 years old at the time. 11 years old? So this is bad. This is pretty terrible, disgusting behavior. However, none of the women ever came forward, and apparently one of the women is now over 50 years old. Without any women coming forward, there were no charges filed. And so while there were no charges, his Hollywood career was immediately ended, and his long-running acting legacy was completely tarnished. And last year, his old co-stars, who were children at the time, now adults, came out publicly to denounce Stephen Collins. Gene Roddenberry wanted to redesign the costumes because he felt that the miniskirts, which may have been exciting for 1960, were too sexist, so he wanted to create a more modern look between the genders. Robert Wise also did not like the uniforms because he did not like the bright Technicolor costumes. Those bright colors work well on the small TV screen during the advent of television, but on the big screen, he worried that they would look too garish and distracting. Also, Wise was looking for verisimilitude. Bright red, yellow, and blue costumes just looked too fake. He wanted the uniforms to look realistic enough and resemble military uniforms. Therefore, he muted the colors to the more realistic pastel earth tones of gray, beige, and sky blue. And it's probably no coincidence that the color palette matches the earth tones of Star Wars, while other fans notice a similarity between the uniforms of Star Trek the Motion Picture and the 1975 television series Space 1999. As filming began, Robert Wise had an unusual problem. The screenplay was not completed. It was being written while the movie was being shot, and the ending wasn't even close to being finished. Soon they found themselves 8 weeks behind schedule while this hard deadline of December 7, 1979 was approaching. Some delays were technical, like lights coming out the wrong color, or a crew member accidentally electrocuting himself. Other delays were just the actors having fun, delaying production. Another occurred when the actress playing Ilea contracted a severe cold that resulted in severe respiratory distress. She had to be constantly removed from scheduling to move to a warmer climate to avoid hypercapnia. The scheduled 4 months of shooting stretched out to 6 months, and it was almost 2 months into filming, and the production still didn't have an ending to the movie. They had an Act 1 and Act 2, but they did not have an Act 3. None of the writers can come up with a working ending. Robert Wise went to everyone, including the cast, for suggestions on how to end the movie. Even William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy gave suggestions, but none of their ideas were really usable. It was John Povil who saved the day. Povil used to be Gene Roddenberry's assistant until Harold Livingston made him story editor and associate producer. John Povil came up with the idea that V'ger needed to evolve and bond with its creator, and the movie could end with Will Dacre merging with Ilea, hence merging with V'ger, to create a new powerful sentient being that would fly off to explore new dimensions. While many didn't like this ending, Robert Wise liked it. It was good enough, and the ending was approved on December of 1978. Final filming was done on January 26, 1979, when Shatner, Nimoy, and Kelley delivered their final lines of principal photography, and all that was left was the final shot of Decker merging with V'ger. This was before the existence of CGI, so the effect was created by covering Decker with tiny dabs of cotton and then illuminating with giant 4,000-watt electric lights and a wind machine. This created an illuminating halo effect, and this was supposed to be finished within a few hours, but had to be done over and over again, and ultimately took a week to film. The movie was finally filmed, and the cast and crew celebrated with a wrap-up party. Robert Wise and Gene Roddenberry took a short break and returned to finish the movie. However, Robert Wise had a problem. Robert Abel had not delivered any special effects. In March 1979, a mere 9 months before the theater release of December 7th, the lawyers representing the theaters came in to remind Paramount that if this movie was not delivered to them by the 7th of December, they could be sued for, who knows, up to $100 million. The musical score was composed by legendary composer Jerry Goldsmith. Jerry Goldsmith was born in Los Angeles, California, and started playing piano at age 6, although he didn't get serious about music until he was 11 years old. At 18, he attended USC, but later dropped out to study music at the Los Angeles City College. At age 21, he got a job as a clerk for CBS and quickly began to be hired for writing musical scores. And one of his first TV jobs at CBS was writing the scores for several episodes of The Twilight Zone. And he remained at CBS writing music for 10 years. At age 31, he left CBS and wrote the musical score for Dr. Kildare, as well as The Man from U.N.C.L.E., and began writing for movies. Throughout the 1960s, he quickly established himself as one of the top musical film score composers, writing the music for The Planet of the Apes, Patton, Papillon, Tora Tora Tora, Logan's Run, The Omen, and many others. He's been nominated for 18 Academy Awards, making him one of the most nominated music composers of all time, but a distant second to his close friend, John Williams. However, he has only won one Academy Award for The Omen. And in 2017, he received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. And he's considered one of the greatest music composers of all time. And Jerry Goldsmith hit gold with a new Star Trek theme. Gene Roddenberry liked the theme so much that he decided to use it for a Star Trek Next Generation TV show. He will go on to compose the themes to Star Trek V, The Final Frontier, Star Trek First Contact, Star Trek Insurrection, Star Trek Nemesis, as well as other films like Alien, Rambo First Blood Part 2, Rambo 3, Total Recall, Air Force One, Rudy, The Mummy, and many, many more. But what about the special effects? Robert Wise went to Abel & Associates and demanded to see what footage they had. And according to reports, Abel & Associates were having trouble delivering the special effects. It had almost been 10 months and millions of dollars spent, and they created almost no usable footage. Robert Abel was a loud, talkative man who dominated the room, and he was known to make a lot of promises. Many people in Hollywood consistently described him with one word: salesman. He impressed Paramount with lots of excellent ideas, but had no way of delivering them. It turned out that Abel & Associates were not experienced at special effects, and he had overpromised and did not know how to create the special effects needed for the movie. Robert Abel was clearly in over his head. He not only spent the $4 million bid, but an extra $1 million that was not initially authorized. He spent a total of $5 million of Paramount's money trying unsuccessfully to learn how to do the job. Abel & Associates had created zero usable footage. The usually calm Robert Wise flipped out and is supposedly to have said, "I don't want to see that SOB ever again." Paramount fired Abel & Associates and had to start completely from scratch. They did not have 1 second's worth of usable film and wasted $5 million of precious money, but Paramount had to cut their losses, and this would further inflate the budget by tens of millions of dollars. And with no usable special effects, Paramount was forced to go to Douglas Trumbull, and fortunately, Trumbull needed Paramount to do his own solo project. And Paramount played a hardball. They demanded he work on this project or they would never work in Hollywood again. Trumbull reluctantly accepted, and Trumbull was given the task of completing the special effects in only 6 months, starting with nothing. Douglas Trumbull was born in Los Angeles, California, and his father was an engineer who briefly worked in Hollywood creating the visual effects for the classic 1939 film, The Wizard of Oz. His mother was an artist who passed away when Doug was 7 years old. And as a child, Doug loved tinkering with mechanical and electrical gadgets, and he loved science fiction space movies. He attended El Camino Junior College and joined the Cartoonist Guild, and his style of choice was to draw photorealistic drawings of spaceships and aliens. However, Hollywood was not interested in his drawings because in the early 1960s, it was believed that no one wanted to see science fiction space movies about spaceships and aliens. Oh, how the times have changed. However, he was hired by Graphic Films, a small animation art studio that made short films for NASA and for the U.S. Air Force. He loved creating special effects and used creative, practical solutions of the time. And this got the attention of Stanley Kubrick, who hired him for the visual effects of 2001: A Space Odyssey. The project took 2 years, and not only did Douglas Trumbull create some incredible special effects, he developed a lot of new filmmaking techniques and really began to learn about the business of filmmaking. His work on the 1968 film 2001: A Space Odyssey won him an Academy Award. Although it was officially given to Stanley Kubrick, it did propel Douglas Trumbull to superstar status. In fact, when George Lucas was making Star Wars, his top choice was Douglas Trumbull, but had other commitments doing the visual effects for Close Encounters of the Third Kind. After Star Trek, he'll go on to do the special effects for Blade Runner and direct his pet project, the 1983 film Brainstorm. And in 1991, he directed Back to the Future: The Ride for Universal Studios. And in 2010, he was inducted into the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. Trumbull went to John Dykstra, founder of ILM, who did the special effects for Star Wars, and asked for help. They split into 2 teams and went immediately to work. Douglas Trumbull and his team started with the introduction of the Enterprise, where Scotty and Kirk see the new ship. Meanwhile, John Dykstra's team started with the Klingon ships that were being electrified by V'ger. Then Douglas Trumbull and his team began work on the inside of V'ger, and his team accomplished this by using multiple layers of matte paintings. It was years before CGI. The effects are beautiful and haunting. And Doug Trumbull and John Dykstra and Robert Wise went into crisis mode, and they worked 7 days a week, 24 hours a day for 6 straight months. And each team broke up into 8-hour shifts, working 24 hours a day, and even brought cots into their offices so they could sleep and then work. It was an amazing Herculean effort. Doug Trumbull, John Dykstra finished the job in 6 months. And what you see on screen is the Herculean effort by these 2 cinematic geniuses. They did a phenomenal job, but apparently it was at a great physical and mental cost. Douglas Trumbull had insomnia and ulcers, and even ended up in the hospital immediately after completion of the film. At the end of production, the initial $16 million had ballooned to $46 million, which is worth $193 million when adjusted for inflation, and was the most expensive movie to date. But Paramount didn't really care at this point because they were more worried about the potential lawsuit, a possible $100 million lawsuit if they didn't deliver this movie on time. Meanwhile, Robert Wise continued to edit the film in order to make the December 7th release date. The Paramount executives told him, "I don't care if this movie has black tape where the special effects are supposed to be. I need a cut of this film in the theaters by December 7th. Paramount was so certain that they would not make the December 7th date and that they would be sued that they began to set up a fall guy. And that fall guy was, of course, Robert Abel. Robert Wise was editing the film as late as December 5th, 2 days before the release of the film, and he didn't even have time to dry the film. When the actual film arrived at the premiere, it was still wet from the processing, and Robert Wise just assumed correctly that the film would dry while being played in the projectors. On the days before December 9th, hundreds of wet cans of film were individually shipped to all the theaters across the country, and Robert Wise hand-held the canister of film to the Hollywood premiere. Paramount didn't care if the movie was good or bad. They were just happy that they made the December 7th date, and they would not be sued. In fact, they were quite expecting the movie to be a disaster. However, during the Hollywood premiere, the scene with the 3 Klingon ships, the audience broke out in applause. And so Paramount realized that maybe they might have a surprise hit on their hands. To everyone's surprise, Star Trek the Motion Picture went on to set a record-breaking box office, making $11.8 million in its opening weekend and made a total of $139 million overall. That's $600 million when adjusted for inflation. Also, it ended up being nominated for 3 Academy Awards: Best Art Direction, Best Visual Effects, and Best Original Score. It was a surprise success, but it did get mixed reviews. Everyone loved the special effects and thought it was stunning. Most critics just thought it was way too boring, and someone dubbed it the slow motion picture. But no one could deny the monetary success of the movie, and that guaranteed that another Star Trek movie would be made. Star Trek was back and better than ever. However, they did recognize how close they came to complete disaster. Paramount needed a fall guy, and that fall guy was Gene Roddenberry. After all, he was the producer on the film and wasn't exactly seen as someone that helped solve the problem, but rather contributed to it. And therefore he was removed from all the sequels and would be kicked upstairs and given the role of creative consultant. That meant that he got to see everything that was made and was allowed to make suggestions, but no one was under any obligation to listen to him. Robert Wise was seen as a hero that averted disaster. However, he was exhausted and so burned out by his experience on this film that he took a break from directing for 10 years. He returned to directing in 1989 and directed a film called Rooftops. In 2001, Paramount Pictures went to Robert Wise and allowed him to go back and re-edit this film. Now the scenes flow much better, new special effects were added. The planet Vulcan looks much better. We get to see the external body of V'ger, and when the crew meet V'ger, the scene looks far more epic. This is now seen as the definitive version of Star Trek the Motion Picture. Now please join us next time as we talk about the sequel, Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. Well, that ends my video on the making of Star Trek the Motion Picture. And if you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. It only takes a second, but it really helps me out. And I'm curious, are you a fan of Star Trek the Motion Picture? Well, tell me about it. Don't forget to leave a comment telling me what you thought of this movie. That ends this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you had a great time. Welcome to Totally Awesome Films, and in this video we're going to talk about the 1982 film, Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan.
Stand by to receive our transmission.
So Star Trek the Motion Picture brought the Star Trek franchise back from the abyss and made a ton of money at the box office. However, the reviews were mixed. In general, die-hard Star Trek fans loved it, and they were ecstatic that the crew was back on screen, and they reveled in the shots of a beautiful new Enterprise. On the other hand, the casual viewers, the non-Star Trek fans, thought the movie was boring. And while the movie did make a lot of money, it fell short of the kind of money Paramount was hoping for, which was the massive amount of money that Star Wars had made. Still, no one could deny that Star Trek was back, and with a new shot at life and on the big screen, a sequel was guaranteed. But what would they do with their second attempt at the big screen? Would the sequel make or break the new Star Trek film franchise? Well, despite the successful box office, the critical reviews were so mixed that internally, Paramount considered Star Trek the Motion Picture somewhat of a failure, and they needed someone to blame. That somebody was Gene Roddenberry. So Gene Roddenberry was basically stripped of all his producing power on the set and was given a small office upstairs and given the new titles of script consultant and executive producer. These were honorary titles. Basically, he had no official power or influence on the Star Trek set. At the time of his demotion, Gene Roddenberry was writing a script for a sequel to Star Trek the Motion Picture. He called it Star Trek III because he felt that the motion picture was Star Trek II. In his 60-page treatment, the crew of the Enterprise returned to Earth to discover that the Federation has never existed. The Klingons used the time portal from the Guardians of Forever to travel back in time and prevent the Federation from existing. The Enterprise traveled back in time to undo what the Klingons changed. The Enterprise would crash in Canada in November 1963. A U-2 plane would mistake it for an alien, and President John F. Kennedy would cancel his trip to Dallas to examine the UFO. This prevents his assassination. Kirk realized that it is he and his crew that changed the timeline, and they mysteriously restore the timeline and return to the 23rd century where the Federation is restored, but they notice small changes like Leonard McCoy having a wife. The story would have been a sequel to the episode of City on the Edge of Forever. Roddenberry also wanted actress Joan Collins to revive her role as Edith Keeler. In a rumored rewrite, Spock would be the assassin behind the grassy knoll, and there was no way that Paramount was going to approve such a script. However, it is interesting that both Roddenberry's and The Eventual Wrath of Khan were both sequels to two of the most popular episodes of the TV series. Paramount needed to bring a new producer who could fully take over production and bring an exciting Star Trek sequel film and do it under budget. And that man was Harve Bennett. Harve Bennett was born to a Jewish family in Chicago, Illinois, and he was the son of a lawyer and a journalist. And as a kid, he was known as a child prodigy and even appeared on a radio show called Quiz Kids, which introduced him to show business. He attended UCLA and graduated UCLA Film School, then joined the U.S. Army and served in the Military Police Corps. His first job was at CBS in New York City, but then moved to ABC, where he quickly rose to become vice president of daytime programming. At ABC, his first job was working with Aaron Spelling to develop the Mod Squad, about a group of young, hip undercover cops. After Mod Squad, Harve Bennett moved to Universal Studios, where he produced The $6 Million Man and The Bionic Woman. He also produced Rich Man, Poor Four Man, The Invisible Man, and The Gemini Man. Harve Bennett was already brought into Paramount Pictures and had been signed to create a series of TV miniseries, one of which would become in 1982 A Woman Called Golda, starring Ingrid Bergman as Golda Meir and co-starring Leonard Nimoy. However, 1 week into his Paramount contract, Harve Bennett was called into a meeting with the top brass at Paramount, and this included Barry Diller, Michael Eisner, and Charles Bloodhorn. So the Paramount executives asked him what he thought of Star Trek the Motion Picture, and Harve Bennett admitted that he thought it was a little boring. Well, they asked if he could make a movie better than the first one, and Bennett answered yes. And then one of the producers asked, well, can you make it for less than $40 million? And Harve Bennett reportedly said the famous line, where I come from, I can make 5 movies for that. Well, apparently, that was the right answer because they hired him right away and gave him a budget of $13 million. The problem was Harve Bennett had never seen an episode of Star Trek. Therefore, he basically took a month off and watched every episode of Star Trek the original series back to back. Now talk about a massive binge watch. Well, he became somewhat of an expert on Star Trek. And the first thing Harve Bennett noticed about Star Trek was, at its core, it was about the triumvirate of James T. Kirk, Spock, and Bones McCoy. Spock would represent the logical side of an issue, while Bones McCoy would represent the passionate, emotional side of an issue, and it would be up to Kirk to consider both sides and wisely discern which way he would approach an issue, more logic or with more emotion. Harve Bennett was also convinced that the problem with the first movie was that it just didn't have a good villain. Star Trek II would need a good villain. And one day, Harve Bennett was watching an old episode of Star Trek from Season 1, Episode 22, called Space Seed, where a genetically engineered Superman named Khan Noonien Singh tries to take over the Enterprise, and Kirk defeats him and exiles Khan and his 70-man crew on a remote planet named Ceti Alpha 5. In the first script for Star Trek, it was going to be called Star Trek II, The War of the Generations, and Admiral Kirk would reassemble the Enterprise crew to investigate a rebellion, and this distant planet had been taken over by Khan Noonien Singh, and the rebels would turn out to be led by Kirk's estranged son David. Admiral Kirk and his son would join forces to overthrow Khan, who was in possession of the Federation's ultimate weapon, the Omega system. And you can actually see a hint of what would become Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. And one addition Harve Bennett made was because Harve was an old army man, and he wanted to bring a sense of military to the series, and he envisioned Starfleet not as an extension of NASA, but as an extension of the U.S. Navy. After all, Kirk was a captain and now an admiral, and all the ranks were from the U.S. Navy, so it was a logical choice. And after all, Gene Roddenberry also had the same idea back in 1966 when he created Star Trek. So they leaned into the Navy motif with ship bells, yeoman's whistles, and other Navy protocol. However, Harve Bennett's art director, Michael Miner, suggested that the Omega system really just seemed too dark, and one of his screenwriters, Jack Soward, suggested, well, why not call it the Genesis device? The device would be actually designed to terraform planets, but would be corrupted into a weapon. And Bennett loved this, and according to the lore, he actually went to Sowards and said, Jack, you just saved Star Trek. In one of the earlier scripts by Jack B. Sowards, there would have been a scene where Khan and Kirk meet in person, and they would have a mano-a-mano battle, but Khan would have psychic powers, would be able to insert images into people's minds, like the Talosians in The Cage. However, Kirk would be able to resist, but they would mentally go to various planets and fight, all in Kirk and Khan's mind. In one scene, they'd be fighting each other with whips, and then in another scene, maybe they might be fighting each other with swords. However, all the different locations would have cost a lot of money, breaking Star Trek II's already small budget. For the director of Star Trek II, Harve Bennett and Paramount went with a fairly unknown director named Nicholas Meyer, who was a friend of Bennett's. Nicholas Meyer was a successful novelist who had written several successful Sherlock Holmes novels and had also written a few screenplays. Nicholas Meyer was born to a Jewish family in New York. He was born to a famous Manhattan psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, and his mother was a famous concert pianist. Meyer went on to graduate from the University of Iowa with a degree in theater and filmmaking. He then gained public attention with his first novel, the 1974 The 7% Solution, about Sherlock Holmes confronting his cocaine addiction with the help of Sigmund Freud. The book was a bestseller, and he would go on to write 4 more Sherlock Holmes novels. Meyer turned his novel, The 7% Solution, into a screenplay, which was turned into a movie starring Nicole Williamson, Merlin and Excalibur, Robert Duvall, and Laurence Olivier. Meyer would be nominated for an Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay. Meyer then tried his hand at directing and directed the 1979 film Time After Time, where Malcolm McDowell played H.G. Wells, who travels to the modern 1970s Manhattan in search of Jack the Ripper, played by David Warner. In 1981, producer Karen Moore asked Nicholas Meyer to direct Star Trek II, to which he asked, "Is that the one with the guy with the ears?" And Karen Moore replied, "Oh, you're such a snob." After directing Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, he'll go on to direct the Tom Hanks John Candy comedy The Volunteers, then write half of Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, and then help rewrite Fatal Attraction. And in 1991, he would write and direct Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. And in 1997, he would help rewrite the James Bond film Tomorrow Never Dies and The Prince of Egypt. Now eventually there'd be 5 different iterations of the script, but Harve Bennett was not really satisfied with any of the 5 scripts. So Harve Bennett asked Nicholas Meyer to help fine-tune the story. But Nicholas Meyer, like Harve Bennett, was not a Star Trek fan and had not seen any episodes of Star Trek. So Nicholas Meyer also binge-watched the Star Trek episodes. While Nicholas Meyer was not a science fiction fan, he was a huge fan of the Horatio Hornblower novels. Now, Horatio Hornblower was a fictional officer in the British Royal Navy during the Napoleonic era, and he starred in 11 popular novels which had him sailing around the world getting into adventures. Nicholas Meyer saw Star Trek as Horatio Hornblower in space, and Harve Bennett 100% agreed with this assessment. Whereas Harve Bennett saw the flaw in the first Star Trek film to be the lack of a good villain, Meyer saw another problem. He thought that the first movie, Star Trek the Motion Picture, took itself way too seriously. He felt the self-importance caused the first movie to feel too wooden, and he thought that the way to make Star Trek a better movie was not to make a Star Trek movie, but to really make a movie about the human condition using the Star Trek characters and the Star Trek universe. And in Nicholas Meyer's own words, he actually joked, "The chief contribution I brought to Star Trek 2 was a healthy disrespect for Star Trek." Nicholas Meyer had 5 different scripts, but felt that none of the 5 worked. Therefore, he and his writing team decided to make a list of everything they liked from each script. Some themes emerged: the Genesis device, Lieutenant Savick, which originally was a male Vulcan, Kirk's son David, and of course, Khan. And furthermore, Meyer thought that the story could be about aging, about a man facing his own mortality. After all, the entire cast of Star Trek was aging, and rather than try to hide the fact, Meyer thought they should address it. Meyer thought it was ridiculous in Star Trek, the motion picture, that everyone had caked on a lot of makeup to try to appear younger. Meyer decided to lean into the theme of aging, and he had Admiral Kirk get a pair of glasses, he had him fear his birthday, he had him meet his adult son. This was a theme that would run throughout the movie. So who would write the script? Well, they didn't have anyone, and principal filming was about to start in 12 days. So Nicholas Meyer offered to write the script himself. However, there was a problem. It would take Paramount weeks, maybe months, to negotiate a new contract for Nicholas Meyer to write the script and for them to negotiate a new salary for writing the script. And they were about to bust their 12-day shooting suspense. So Nicholas Meyer did something that was unheard of in Hollywood. He wrote the official draft of the screenplay in 12 days for no pay and for no credit. And that's why, despite the fact that Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, the movie that you see on screen, is the version Nicholas Meyer wrote by himself, there's no mention of him in the writing credits. The fact that he didn't even want writing credits, he just cared about the final product, really impressed the producers, the studio, and the actors, and it gave him huge credibility on the set with the cast and crew. And ultimately, Nick Meyer's script is what ended up on the screen. And another thing that gave him credibility with the cast and crew was that everyone recognized that the script he wrote was excellent. In fact, when Harve Bennett was gathering the old Star Trek cast together, DeForest Kelley, who played Dr. Leonard McCoy, actually declined to return. He was older than the rest of the cast, he had already had a successful acting career doing westerns, and even co-starred in the legendary film Shootout at the OK Corral with Burt Lancaster and Kirk Douglas. At this time, DeForest Kelley didn't really identify with the Star Trek character and felt he didn't really need it. And he wasn't really satisfied with his experience, nor his character arc in the last film, Star Trek the Motion Picture. So he turned down the opportunity to return for Star Trek II, but kept an open mind just in case a good script came along. However, when Harve Bennett sent him the new script, which was freshly written by Nicholas Meyer, DeForest Kelley read it and called Harve Bennett immediately and said, "Now this is a little more like it," and signed on. Another satisfied customer was Walter Koenig, who played Pavel Chekhov. To put everything into context, after the cancellation of Star Trek the original series, Walter Koenig had difficulty getting roles, and to add insult to injury, when Gene Roddenberry started production of Filmation's Star Trek the Animated Series, also known as The Animated Adventures of Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek, all the cast were asked to return as voice actors, everyone but Walter Koenig, and Chekhov never appeared on the show. And Koenig was very upset by this. Then in Star Trek the Motion Picture, he was dismayed at how little he, George Takei, and Nichelle Nichols were utilized. They were nothing but glorified background actors. Well, we know the prominent role Chekhov had in Star Trek II, so imagine you're Walter Koenig, and you're reading the script for the first time and thinking, "Oh my god, I must be dreaming." He was so excited how prominent his character was in the movie that he said he kept expecting something to go wrong and pop his bubble. But by the time he got to the end of Nicholas Meyer's script, the one that ended up being the movie we saw, he was ecstatic. Finally, a movie that gave Pavel Chekhov his due. And later, when it came time for the scene on Ceti Alpha 5 where Khan says to Chekhov,
"I never forget a face, Mr. Chekhov. Isn't it?
Well, Walter Koenig realized that Khan never met Chekhov. Walter Koenig, hence Pavel Chekhov, joined the cast in season 2, and the episode Space Seed was season 1. Koenig was terrified that someone would mention this and someone would have to alter the script and lessen his role, so Koenig just kept his mouth shut. Fortunately, Ricardo Montalban had no idea that Khan had never met Chekhov, and the whole scene, in fact, Walter Koenig's relief, the whole movie, the Chekhov role went off without a hitch. Only later, after the movie was out, did fans begin to mention that Khan had never met Chekhov in the TV series. However, it was later retconned that Chekhov only joined the bridge in the second season, and he was likely on the USS Enterprise in season 1 working in the lower decks. Therefore, it was retconned that Khan likely met Chekhov there. And I do like that. Everyone loved the script except one person, and that person was William Shatner. And he apparently hated it. And this sent Nicholas Meyer into a panic. After all, this is only his second movie, and he felt that if one person could derail his entire movie career and get the entire script thrown out, or worse, get him fired off the project, it was the star, William Shatner. In a panic, he went to Harve Bennett, and Harve Bennett calmly told him to give Shatner what he wanted. So Nicholas Meyer spent a few days making minor adjustments to the script to buff up Admiral Kirk's importance and appease William Shatner's ego. And in Nicholas Meyer's own words, he simply made sure that Kirk was always the first in the room. It wasn't a drastic change. They were just very minor and simple rewrites, but it totally worked. William Shatner was very happy with the second draft of the script, and Meyer got no more complaints. One other change was that in the original script, Admiral Kirk's birthday is mentioned, and he's turning 49. William Shatner didn't like this, so in the rewrite, there's no mention of Admiral Kirk's age, leaving it a mystery. And this was a huge lesson for Nicholas Meyer. He learned how easy but important it is to consider and appease the individual egos of the movie stars. And secondly, he learned the importance of having an experienced mentor around, in this case Harve Bennett, who can really help you in the time of crisis. Everyone on the set of Star Trek II decided the uniforms needed a change. So the old pastel lounge uniforms from Star Trek the Motion Picture were dyed red and retooled to look more like modern Navy uniforms. For the look of the new uniforms, costume designers based the look on the 1952 film The Prisoner of Zenda. And in that movie, the fictional British military uniforms had the similar triangular theme in the front. But Gene Roddenberry objected to this. But Gene Roddenberry's objections were kindly ignored by Paramount. And we know that this uniform will go on to define Star Trek, not only for the next 5 films, but also define this era of Star Trek for the next 40 years and beyond. Paramount contacted Ricardo Montalban to see if he would be interested in reprising his role of Khan Noonien Singh. Ricardo Montalban was born in Mexico City to Spanish immigrants in Mexico, and as a teenager, Ricardo moved to Los Angeles with his sister, and at the age of 19 moved to New York City to pursue a career in stage acting. And in 1941, at the age of 21, he returned to Mexico and starred in several Mexican films. But it was his 1943 film Santa that made him an overnight movie star in Mexico. And at this time, MGM was filming a movie in Mexico, the 1947 film Fiesta, and needed a Mexican actor to play a bullfighter. They hired Ricardo Montalban, and the movie was a hit, and MGM signed Ricardo Montalban to a long-term contract. For MGM, he starred in many movies throughout the 1950s and 1960s, and he also had notable guest roles on TV, including spots in The Wild Wild West, I Spy, and Mission Impossible, and a very memorable spot on an episode of Star Trek, an episode known as Space Seed. One of his notable acting roles was that of Armando in Escape from the Planet of the Apes and Conquest of the Planet of the Apes. And in 1977, he was hired for the main role of Mr. Rourke in the hit TV series Fantasy Island, where he played the benevolent patriarch of a magical island that grants its guests their most desired fantasy, a role he played until 1984. And in 1982, he was hired to reprise his role as Khan Noonien Singh in this movie. And Ricardo Montalban came on set and filmed all of the scenes in 12 days. Nicholas Meyer said that working with Ricardo Montalban was an absolute pleasure because he was used to expecting actors to be selfish or arrogant, but found Ricardo Montalban very humble, very gracious, and the perfect gentleman. Furthermore, Montalban worked hard to do exactly what Nicholas Meyer wanted. Nicholas Meyer described Montalban like driving an expensive sports car like a Maserati. Nicholas Meyer described Ricardo Montalban as saying, "That's how every movie should be." Furthermore, after Montalban came on set and filmed all of his scenes in those 12 days, he noticed all of the other actors change. He felt that everyone was working harder and putting more effort into every scene. He felt the simple presence of Montalban Montalban elevated everyone's behavior on set and their performances on screen. When Ricardo Montalban signed on, he initially had difficulty playing Khan at first, and he noticed he was playing Khan as if he were Mr. Rourke. So Ricardo Montalban watched himself play Khan by watching the episode of Space Heat over and over again, and by the fourth time through watching the episode, Montalban began to form the character of Khan, leading to that amazing performance we saw in film. And for the record, we now know that it was definitely Ricardo Montalban's own chest displayed in the movie. Harve Bennett and Paramount were able to hire George Lucas's Industrial Light and Magic, owned by Lucasfilm, to do the special effects on Star Trek II. Industrial Light and Magic, who did the special effects on all the Star Wars films, had quickly established themselves as the leader in special effects. And one of the things that Lucasfilm was dabbling into as early as 1981 was three-dimensional computer graphics. The team at ILM created a short three-dimensional computer-generated infomercial known as the Genesis sequence. We see a missile fired at a dead planet, and slowly we see mountains forming and eventually replacing this dead planet with a lush green biosphere. This sequence would have been impossible to do with practical effects or traditional cartoon animation, and in this short Genesis sequence, we see a preview of the future of cinema, the birth of CGI. It is no surprise that ILM would go on to pioneer this technology and eventually create dinosaurs in Jurassic Park and even an entire digital world of the Star Wars prequel films. For the musical score, the production could not afford Jerry Goldsmith, whose fee would have broken the budget. Furthermore, Harve Bennett also wanted to separate his movie from Star Trek the Motion Picture, and that meant having completely different music. So the team accepted auditions from almost every musician in Hollywood, and Nicholas Meyer listened to hundreds of submitted musical tapes and found James Horner. James Horner was a relative unknown who had only composed the score to a few Roger Corman films, but it was evident that James Horner understood music and was very talented, and offered the score Star Trek II for only $10,000. In fact, after the completion of Star Trek II, Paramount was so pleased with James Horner that they paid him an extra $25,000 bonus. Now, $10,000 may seem way too low, but James Horner is going to parlay this into a brilliant and successful Hollywood career. Not only will he score the next film, Star Trek III, but he's going to become one of Hollywood's most in-demand music composers. He will go on to compose the score for Titanic, for Avatar, for Karate Kid, and for The Amazing Spider-Man. And he's going to have an amazing career. In fact, by the time Star Trek VI was being produced, only 9 years later, James Horner was too expensive for Paramount to use. In keeping with the Horatio Hornblower and Navy motif, Harve Bennett and Nicholas Meyer wanted the spaceships to resemble an underwater submarine battle. In other words, the space battles would feel like two huge vessels slowly and strategically moving through space like a chess match. However, they worried about one problem. Would audiences be able to differentiate the two spaceships on screen? Well, the solution came by a happy accident. In the original look of the USS Reliant, which was designed by Joe Jennings, Mike Meyer, and Lee Cole, the Reliant had a familiar saucer section connected to the hull, but had its distinct warp nacelles oriented upwards, similar to the USS Enterprise. However, Harve Bennett saw the blueprints upside down and approved the design, and the production crew just went with it. And I love the design of the USS Reliant, with its downward pointing warp nacelles, and it certainly contrasts well with the USS Enterprise. To further contrast the two ships, they added a red light to the saucer of the Reliant, while the Enterprise remained white and blue. And the final touch of differentiation came with a music score. Every time we saw the Reliant on screen, we heard Khan's musical theme, while anytime we saw the Enterprise, we got Kirk's musical theme. It worked fantastically well, and there was no way we can confuse the two ships. Meanwhile, Gene Roddenberry continued to disagree and clash with Nicholas Meyer. In one incident, Nicholas Meyer wanted the Enterprise to resemble an old submarine and put a sign that said, "No smoking." But Gene Roddenberry objected, stating that cigarette smoking would have disappeared by the 23rd century, so there would not be a need of a sign on a ship. In another incident, Nicholas Meyer wanted David to tie a sweater around his shoulder, but Gene Roddenberry objected, stating that such a specific style was specific to the 20th century and would have disappeared by the 23rd century. And one of the biggest objections from Roddenberry came when Admiral Kirk spots the SETI eel coming out of Chekhov's ear, and he shoots it with a phaser and fries it. Gene Roddenberry insisted that Kirk would not do this. He insisted this is a new life form that we've never encountered. He wouldn't just destroy it. He would capture it, study it, and learn about it, and learn how it could benefit society. As for Lieutenant Savick, Kirstie Alley was hired. Now, Kirstie Alley was born in Wichita, Kansas, and attended Kansas State University, but dropped out after finishing her sophomore year to move to Los Angeles to study Scientology. And while in Los Angeles, she appeared on The Match Game in 1979 and Password Plus in 1980. But in 1981, tragedy struck Kirstie Alley when her parents were involved in an automobile crash and was struck by a drunk driver and her mother was killed and her father was seriously injured. And in 1981, Kirstie Alley auditioned for the role of Lieutenant Saavik in the Star Trek sequel. As a child, Kirstie Alley was a huge Star Trek fan and especially a fan of Spock. As a child, she used to fantasize about being Spock's daughter and used to practice raising her eyebrows like Spock and practice talking like him. And so the role of Saavik was perfect for her, and during the audition, everyone was impressed how Kirstie Alley nailed the impression of a female Spock, and she won the role. And while her role as Lieutenant Saavik was popular with fans, Kirstie Alley chose not to return as Saavik in the third movie, so the role of Saavik was recast. But after Wrath of Khan, she starred in the comedy Summer School with Mark Harmon, but it was her role as Rebecca Howe in 6 seasons of the hit sitcom Cheers that propelled her to television royalty. She played Rebecca Howe until the series finale in the 11th season. The role won her an Emmy and a Golden Globe. And while Cheers was on the air, she also starred in the comedy Look Who's Talking opposite John Travolta, featuring Bruce Willis as the voice of her infant son, Mikey. The film was popular and became a franchise hit with Look Who's Talking 2 and Look Who's Talking Now. And in a deleted scene, we actually see that the character of Lieutenant Saavik was indeed half Romulan.
Protege's first rate. Trifle emotional. She is half Romulan, Jim. The admixture tends to make her more volatile than me, for example.
And in another awesome deleted scene, we see a scene where Lieutenant Saavik and Kirk's son David are flirting with each other, suggesting a potential future romance.
Course to CD Alpha 5, all is well.
Good. I believe you know David Marcus. She's learning by doing.
So fans know a lot of lore surrounding the making of this film. How Leonard Nimoy only agreed to play Spock on the condition that his character would die? Well, this is somewhat true. Leonard Nimoy was not interested in returning as Spock. Leonard Nimoy had just written a book called I Am Not Spock and was ready to be done with Spock. The main reason was that Leonard Nimoy believed that Star Trek was over and that Paramount was simply trying to beat a dead horse. He wanted Star Trek to rest. This assessment made sense because how many canceled TV shows would go on to be revived and become more popular than the original? In 1981, absolutely none. It really had never happened. In fact, even today, I can't think of any cases where a canceled TV franchise suddenly gets fully resurrected. So Nimoy was not interested in playing Spock any further. However, to entice him, producers offered him a great death scene. Now, Nimoy believed that Star Trek was gonna be dead and thought Star Trek II was certain to be the last Star Trek movie. So Nimoy signed on for one more movie. And in his own words, he said, "I wanted the character to go out in a blaze of glory." Well, Gene Roddenberry objected to the death of Spock, and when his objections were ignored, Roddenberry leaked the information about Spock's death at a Star Trek convention, and fans were outraged. Paramount Studios received thousands of protest letters, and producers even began receiving death threats. Now keep in mind, this was before the age of the internet, when there were very few movie leaks. So the fact that this was a huge leak was crazy. And it was at this point that even the popular sci-fi magazine Starlog published a poll whether Paramount should kill off Spock or not. Harv Bennett and his assistant had put a simple tracking code into each script. Every copy of the script was different and had a different typo in each script. It was a random period in a different place. Therefore, they could track who leaked the script. And when they tracked a leak, it was Gene Roddenberry. Roddenberry objected to the death of Spock, and when his objections were ignored, he went directly to the fans. In earlier versions of the script, Spock died a meaningless death at the beginning of the movie. In subsequent versions of the script, his death was moved progressively later in the story, and one of the writers suggested that they should tie the death of Spock to Kirk in a meaningful way, and this led to Spock dying at the end of the movie, saving everyone on the Enterprise. Therefore, the directors cleverly faked his death early in the movie, and of course when you see the movie, in the opening Kobayashi Maru scene, to throw off viewers, Spock dies, and then of course it turns out it was only a simulation. And even at one point in the film, Kirk turns to Spock and says,
"Aren't you dead?"
And this was very clever, and it worked. The fans thought, oh well, I guess this is what they meant by Spock dying, and some people thought this might have been a clever marketing trick, and fans are reassured as they watch the movie without any expectation of Spock dying. And then suddenly at the end of the film, when Khan detonates the Genesis device and the warp engines on the Enterprise are not working, everyone thinks they're gonna die, and suddenly Spock gets up from his chair. And when Spock sacrifices his own life to fix the warp engines and save the entire crew of the Enterprise, his death scene had tremendous impact. And while filming the scene where Kirk and Spock say goodbye to each other, the entire cast and crew began to cry during the filming of the scene, and they knew they had something special. And at that point, Nick Meyer says he knew he was filming more than a Star Trek movie. He was filming a genuine movie that was resonating with emotion. Harve Bennett even joked that they should have thanked Roddenberry for forcing them to put Spock's death at the ending, which worked so much better than the original plan of him having a meaningless death at the beginning of the movie, which was actually the version that Gene leaked. It was Roddenberry that forced the change. And at this time, Leonard Nimoy began to have an understanding that this movie was going to be a huge success, that Star Trek II was going to be a massive hit, and Nimoy began to understand that this movie would not only revive Star Trek, but possibly make Star Trek more popular than it had ever been. This film would be the rebirth of Star Trek, and he understood that Star Trek was back and bigger than ever, and Nimoy began to deeply regret killing off Spock. At the premiere screening of Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, it was a huge hit. When Spock died, there was not a dry eye in the audience. However, as the audience left the screening, there was a heavy gloom of depression among everyone who saw the film, and Harve Bennett and Leonard Nimoy worried that all this movie did was make people depressed. Harve Bennett asked Leonard Nimoy if he could think of some way to open the door for the possible return of Spock. And Leonard Nimoy came up with a quick scene where Spock mind melds with Dr. McCoy and says, "Remember." They further inserted a sequence showing Spock's casket as having soft landed on planet Genesis, giving the viewers a sense of hope that Spock could return. And they also had Leonard Nimoy speaking the final lines.
Space, the final frontier. These are the continuing voyages of the Starship Enterprise.
And it was a brilliant move, and it worked. Apparently, when they showed the premiere the second time, the movie completely scored. There was not a dry eye in the theater, but at the end of the movie, the audiences left the screening happy with a sense of hope. And everyone knew they had a hit in their hands. However, director Nicholas Meyer was very upset by this and objected strenuously. He felt the filmmakers were cheating the audience by putting them through an emotional roller coaster of Spock's death and then suddenly saying, "Just kidding, he'll be back in the next movie," and therefore he refused to have anything to do with the sequel, Star Trek III. And Star Trek II had transcended the tiny niche of the TV series Star Trek and had simply made an excellent movie-going experience of any genre. The studios knew they had a success. Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan was both a huge critical and box office success, and made on a minuscule budget of under $14 million, it grossed $78 million in the US and $97 million worldwide, and plus it went on to make huge profits in video sales. Back in 1983, most VHS Betamax movies were priced at between $80 to $100 or more, which is worth over $300 to $400 when adjusted for inflation. And that's because videotapes were marketed to video rental stores. The average customer really didn't own many VHS movies. You rented them. So Paramount Studios had this weird new vision, which was considered unconventional at the time, and it was an idea that people may want to own their VHS movies. So they priced this movie at the ultra low price of $39.95 and marketed it directly to the individual consumer. And this was kind of risky because it had never really been done before. And it was a huge success, and Paramount ended up selling twice their projected target. So basically, Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan was one of the movies that began the now accepted practice of customers buying movies and building a video collection. Well, that ends the story of Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, and please join me next time when we talk about Star Trek III: The Search for Spock. Now, I want to remind you, if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to my channel. It only takes a few seconds, but it really helps me out. And don't forget to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell so you get more videos as soon as they come out. And also, make sure to leave a comment. Tell me what you thought of Star Trek II. Well, that ends this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you had a great time. Hello, welcome to Totally Awesome Films, and in this episode, we're going to talk about the 1984 film Star Trek III: The Search for Spock. The film that is clearly the exception to the odd number curse theory, because this movie is fantastic. And the trio of Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, this film, and Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home make up a perfect trilogy to rival any of the best trilogies out there.
Admiral, we're losing precious time.
What course, please, Admiral? Mr. Scott?
I'd be grateful, Admiral, if you'd give the word.
May the wind be at our backs. Stations.
So due to the critical and box office success of Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, Paramount gave Harve Bennett the approval for a sequel on the night of the Star Trek II premiere, and Bennett said this was the fastest green light he had ever received. Bennett knew that Spock would be returning in some form or another, and also knew that he'd be writing the story himself. And Star Trek III was officially greenlit. However, because Wrath of Khan and the character of Khan Noonien Singh was so popular, not to mention his portrayal by the great Ricardo Montalban, Harv Bennett and the Paramount producers immediately moved to pitch a Khan spin-off sequel. A script was even written, and it was titled Star Trek Prison Planet, and would have starred Ricardo Montalban, and it would deal with the events of Captain Kirk marooning Khan and his crew on Ceti Alpha 5 and cover the events until Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan. However, a decision was made to prioritize and focus entirely on Star Trek III, and Star Trek II Prison Planet slowly faded into obscurity. Bennett had decided to be the sole writer of Star Trek III and wrote the screenplay in 6 weeks and turned in a script by September 1982, and it was titled Return to Genesis, although the script would be vastly different from what ended up on screen. Early story ideas had Kirk being under house arrest, Sulu would steal the Enterprise and rescue Spock, and when Spock was found on Genesis, he would be a de-evolved Vulcan Neanderthal. In the next draft, Kirk would steal the Enterprise with Sulu, and they would be attacked by Romulans, and Kirk would crash the Enterprise while fighting them. And in this draft, Spock would be found to age along with the Genesis planet as if there was a mysterious connection between the two. And there was even an idea where we would meet Spock's long-lost brother, who would join the crew to look for Spock's body. He would not be Sybok, but this idea was also abandoned. A problem that Harv Bennett had was Genesis, because once you introduce a terraforming device to the world of Star Trek, you can't ignore it. There'd be no reason for hunger or overpopulation in the Star Trek universe. Every story problem could be resolved with Genesis. And fans were already asking what would happen if the Klingons got a hold of this doomsday weapon. Therefore, it became necessary for this movie to undo the concept of Project Genesis. Harv Bennett had the idea that Project Genesis was corrupted because David Marcus cheated and used a controversial substance called protomatter. And this was Bennett's way of erasing Genesis from Star Trek continuity. And that would mean that David Marcus would have to be punished for his sins. His character would be a Greek tragedy where he would have to die for interfering with Mother Nature. Originally, B.B. Besh was going to return as Carol Marcus. However, once it was decided that David Marcus cheated to create Genesis, then the presence of Carol Marcus began to create too many questions. Did she know that David used protomatter? Did she use protomatter herself? And if she did she keep that information secret from Kirk? It became too complicated, so the best solution that Harv Bennett could come up with was to remove her from the movie. Out of sight, out of mind. But unfortunately, B.B. Besh was devastated and apparently cried when she was told that she would not be in Star Trek III. However, after seeing Star Trek III, she called Harv Bennett and told him that he made the right choice. Nicholas Meyer was upset that they were resurrecting Spock, and he felt that the filmmakers were messing with the audience. They were putting the audience through an emotional ringer and then say, "Just kidding, he's going to be back in this movie." And therefore, he refused to have anything to do with Star Trek III. For the director, executives were considering James Goldstone, who was a Hollywood staple, and he directed some B-level Hollywood movies and had directed some Star Trek TV episodes, including the second pilot, Where No Man Has Gone Before, the one that got Star Trek approved. And so Paramount had to go to Leonard Nimoy to see if he even wanted to be in this movie, because they were ready to offer him anything to have him play Spock in this movie. And he reportedly told them, "You're damn right, and I want to direct that picture." Well, they were intrigued by the idea of Leonard Nimoy directing and returning, even though Spock was dead. Because Leonard Nimoy had wanted to direct an episode of Star Trek the original series, but was not given the opportunity. With Star Trek III, he saw himself as the solution for the Paramount executives. Because after all, very few people knew and understood Star Trek as well as Nimoy. And he had already directed an episode of T.J. Hooker and several episodes of Night Gallery. Well, they were intrigued with the idea of Leonard Nimoy directing and returning even though Spock was dead. So they gave him their blessing, and Nimoy went home and waited for the call from his agent, and apparently nobody called until weeks later. They finally scheduled a meeting with Michael Eisner, who was the head of Paramount Studios at the time, and Michael Eisner loved the idea, especially from a marketing point of view. Leonard Nimoy directing the return of Spock. It was a really cool concept, and it also created a little bit of mystery, like maybe Nimoy is just directing, and maybe Spock doesn't come back. So it was a great idea, they shook hands, and Nimoy thought it was a done deal. So he went home and waited for the call, and again, no call came for weeks. And finally, Nimoy actually called Michael Eisner himself and asked, "What's going on?" And when he said, I thought you liked the idea. And Michael Eisner said, "Look, I can't let you do it because everyone knows you hate Spock." And Nimoy insisted that he didn't hate Spock, but Michael Eisner said, "Come on, you even had it in your contract that Spock had to die." After all, Leonard Nimoy did not want to return for Star Trek II, so the directors had to entice him by agreeing to give him a great death scene. So of course there was a rumor in Hollywood, and in the Star Trek fandom that Nimoy hated the character. And of course, it should be noted that Nimoy had just written a book titled, I Am Not Spock. Well, Nimoy insisted to Michael Eisner that he didn't hate Spock and that he actually loved Spock. He even asked Michael Eisner to go find the contract which should be stored in his building and see where in the contract that it says Spock must die. Well, whatever he said, it worked, and Michael Eisner was convinced and Nimoy got the job. However, Paramount had only one condition for Leonard Nimoy to return and direct, and that was that he had to return as Spock for the next movie, Star Trek IV. Now, Nimoy thought that the entire cast would be glad to have him at the helm, and he thought of it as one of our own is finally directing the film. However, that was not the case. The entire cast was very skeptical and basically had an attitude like, well, so what's this about? Fortunately, Nimoy was able to prove himself and slowly earn the cast's respect. Firmly in the director's chair, Leonard Nimoy went to work. Ultimately, Leonard Nimoy envisioned Star Trek III as being a huge space opera. He wanted a grand scope about life and death with broad emotions. It would have wind and storms and fire and punishment from the gods. Nimoy also wanted Star Trek III to be about friendship and the sacrifice one is willing to make for a friend. And he felt that the true Star Trek was not about the journey into space or fighting aliens, but rather about friendship between the Enterprise crew. And of course, this is explored to absolute perfection in Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home. The final script that made it to the screen was a collaboration between Harve Bennett and Leonard Nimoy. And Harve Bennett said that Nimoy was basically his editor in Star Trek III, and Bennett was also impressed by what a great writer Leonard Nimoy was. Bennett and Nimoy finished the final draft of the script and handed the script to William Shatner, and when he read it, Shatner believed that his part in the movie was too small and he was just standing by for things to happen. And Leonard Nimoy and Harve Bennett realized that he was right and they had forgotten to protect the star. So they went back and rewrote the movie, making small changes to make Admiral Kirk the leader of every scene. And William Shatner was satisfied. And to Nimoy's brilliance, he gave every character his shining moment. Uhura gets to manhandle and humble a young cocky Starfleet officer. Scotty sabotages a pursuing ship. And the best scene of all is when Sulu gets to demonstrate his martial arts skills by throwing around a much larger security guard. When George Takei read this scene in the script, he didn't initially get it and thought that the guard calling him tiny was offensive. However, when he saw the film at the premiere and saw the reaction from the fans, it was that moment that he realized what a fan pleaser that scene was.
Don't call me tiny.
After all, Leonard Nimoy really had all of his castmates' interests at heart. And now with the hindsight of Star Trek III and Star Trek IV, we absolutely know how much he was looking out for his castmates. And the cast was impressed how much Leonard Nimoy let them experiment with their characters and all the open-minded input Nimoy had from the actors. And after completion of the movie, the cast and crew admitted that they had a great time, possibly more fun than they had in any previous episode of Star Trek, as well as the previous two movies. Everyone was happy that Nimoy directed Star Trek III. One of the odd things that I remember noticing when I first watched this film was that the Klingons were flying a Romulan bird of prey. After all, cloaking was primarily a Romulan technology, not Klingon. And I wondered if anyone else noticed this discrepancy, because now, since then, the little green Klingon bird of prey has become an iconic Klingon ship, with the new Romulan ships looking very different, more rounded. Well, this ship was originally designed to be Romulan. In the original script, the Romulans were the villains, and a sleek new modern-looking Romulan bird of prey was designed by Leonard Nimoy himself. And Leonard had the idea of a modern version of the Romulan bird of prey as seen in the episode Balance of Terror. But Nimoy wanted to make it look more threatening and menacing, and had this idea to make it look like a bodybuilder flexing his shoulders and trapezius muscles. And when ILM asked him what the ship should look like, he raised both his arms, demonstrating the bodybuilder motion. And he also wanted the ship that could have moving wings based on whether it was cruising for attack or if it was flying at warp speed. Leonard Nimoy also had a vision of the bird with a long neck, like a bird swooping into the ocean just before it catches its prey. And he even drew the bird logo on the bottom of the ship as an homage to the Romulan ship in Balance of Terror. However, the studios insisted that the villains be changed to the Klingons, who were better known, and Harve Bennett and Leonard Nimoy agreed that they would be more cinematic. A studio poll by Paramount showed that fans really wanted to see the Klingons in this movie, and Harve Bennett agreed, and the villains were changed from Romulans to the Klingons. However, they didn't have a budget to recreate the Klingon ship, so instead they changed the script so that the Klingons are attacked by Romulans, and they board onto the Romulan ship, they kill the Romulans and take over their bird of prey. However, this scene was not filmed, and the movie was filmed with them just starting off on this Romulan ship. And of course, people remember that there was this treaty where Klingons and Romulans shared ships. And in fact, in an episode of the original series, when the Romulans attacked, they actually attacked with Klingon warbirds. So at that time, it was done to save money, and I guess it was done here to save money. So hence, the green bird of prey became a Klingon ship. And since then, the Klingon bird of prey has become iconic and has defined the look of the Klingons, really for the rest of the entire series up to now. It'll return in Star Trek V, it'll return in Star Trek VI, and even be in The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine. The Romulans themselves would get a whole new, different, more rounded ships for the Next Generation TV show and beyond. And since the Klingons were the new villains for this movie, Nimoy wanted to flesh out a new Klingon language for the movie. And Nimoy and Bennett hired linguist Mark Okrand to create a full working Klingon language. And Mark Okrand was very excited about this job and took the job very seriously. He used the Klingon dialogue from Star Trek The Motion Picture, which was created by James Doohan, but he also referenced the original TV series. Now, in the original TV series, the Klingons all spoke English, but we did get Klingon names. Kang, Kor, Kolath, and Korax were the 4 Klingons named in the original series, so this gave Mark Okrand the idea to have the Klingon language have lots of hard Ks. And then he added phonetics used in Star Trek The Motion Picture. And the script itself said that the Klingons spoke in a guttural language, so he added a lot of guttural sounds like huh, and sh. And then Mark Okrand completely created a grammatical structure that was internally consistent and also intentionally very different from English. He created idioms and slangs, and in 1984, Okrand published a Klingon dictionary. And today, Klingon has grown into a fully realized language that people study and speak. In fact, more people speak Klingon than many of the world's languages. People around the world study it, books are published in Klingon, stage plays are performed in Klingon. So this fake language, created in 1984, has now become real. Another new addition was a new ship called the USS Excelsior, which was introduced as a ship that's superior to the USS Enterprise in every way. Because Nimoy and Bennett wanted to design the next generation of starships, a natural evolution from our favorite ship. And they went to the designers and asked for an Enterprise as if it were designed by the Japanese. And the designer came up with a sleek new Excelsior, and this ship became a fan favorite and would appear again in Star Trek IV and again in Star Trek VI and multiple times in The Next Generation. And when the Enterprise B is premiered in Star Trek Generations, it was the Excelsior class. And we also get a new space dock, which is supposed to be massive, and it was supposed to be 5 miles high and apparently visible from the Earth. And the model used to portray the new space dock was 6 feet high. Now here is where we're going to talk about the main villain in this movie, the Klingon commander. So I want to ask you, how do you pronounce his name? Is it Kruge or is it Krug? Or is it Kruga? In a fan survey on the internet, when they asked this question, Kruge barely beat out Krug. Meanwhile, in the audio novelization, he is pronounced Krug, and meanwhile, a Google search claims that it is pronounced Kruge, but that just seems wrong. I searched many interviews and I couldn't find a cast member pronouncing his name. However, the name is pronounced once in the movie. It is pronounced in the beginning by Valkyris.
Commander Krug.
It can go both ways, but I feel it mostly sounds like Krug.
Commander Krug. Commander Krug.
So I'll go with Krug for this video. If I'm wrong, please tell me in the comments. I'd like to hear your opinion. Is it Kruge or is it Krug? Tell me in the comments and tell me who and where your source comes from. Let's settle this once and for all. Now for the role of Krug, Leonard Nimoy wanted Edward James Olmos, who blew everyone away with his audition. And at that time, Edward James Olmos was famous as the police chief on Miami Vice, and 2 decades later would define Admiral Adama in the 2005 hit television show Battlestar Galactica. Edward Olmos gave Krug a menacing vibe, but instilled him with gravitas. He was almost perfect except one factor. Olmos was short, shorter than most of the actors, and shorter than most of the Star Trek crew, especially William Shatner. Harve Bennett himself wanted Christopher Lloyd, who played it much broader and more operatic. However, Nimoy continued to champion Edward James Olmos, insisting he could use old Hollywood tricks like forced perspective to make Olmos look taller than Shatner. However, in the end, Christopher Lloyd's height and operatic performance won out over Edward James Olmos' intensity and gravitas. However, the Paramount producers were a little worried since Christopher Lloyd was basically known for his 5-year role as the stoner Reverend Jim on Taxi.
What does a yellow light mean? Slow down. Okay. What? Yellow light mean? Slow down. Okay. What does a yellow light mean? Slow down.
They thought of him as a goofy comedian and objected to his casting. However, Leonard Nimoy stood his ground and insisted that Lloyd get the part and fought any studio pushback. After all, Leonard Nimoy of all people understand what it's like to be unfairly typecast. Fortunately, everyone loved Lloyd's performance, and Commander Krug quickly became a fan favorite. Also, Leonard Nimoy changed the culture of the Klingons from the expansionist seen in the original television series and added a warrior's code similar to that of the samurai of feudal Japan. In this movie, Klingons are easily willing to sacrifice their own lives in the service of the mission, and this depiction resonated with the fans. It would be expanded upon in Star Trek The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, and now almost as many fans identify with the Klingon culture as they do with the Federation. One noticeable casting change was that of Lieutenant Saavik, played brilliantly by Kirstie Alley in Star Trek II, and here she is replaced by Robin Curtis. And Curtis would play a different kind of Saavik. Kirstie Alley Saavik was supposed to be half Vulcan and half Romulan, and the way Alley played Saavik, you can see the passionate Vulcan bubbling underneath. Robin Curtis played Saavik as a full Vulcan, and fans have speculated that being directed by Leonard Nimoy would be likely to Vulcanize Saavik rather than the other way around. And it was no secret that Alley did not have a good time on the set of Star Trek II. However, Kirstie Alley has said in later interviews that she actually wanted to return, but the salary they offered her for Star Trek III was actually less than that of Star Trek II, and Alley felt that it was insultingly low and had to turn down the offer. A few years later, Kirstie Alley would nab the role of Rebecca Howe on the hit TV sitcom Cheers, and as a protagonist in the Look Who's Talking franchise, and this would launch her career into the stratosphere. During the stealing of the Enterprise, we see Chekhov wearing a spandex suit that has Little Lord Fauntleroy collars, and it's so bizarre. And this is because Bob Fletcher, the costume designer, decided to design everyone's civilian outfits based on aspects of their Star Trek character. So Bones McCoy's outfit came from the style of Southern Georgia gentlemen. Admiral Kirk got a really macho leather jacket reminiscent of naval flyers. So what about Chekhov? Bob Fletcher had the idea that since Pavel Chekhov is Russian, he would be a fan of the Russian poet Alexander Pushkin. And since Alexander Pushkin is always drawn with huge white collars, that's why they designed it that way. And when Walter Koenig saw the outfit, he thought it looked ridiculous. And then when Michael Eisner saw it, he said he didn't like it. So Leonard Nimoy took Chekhov out of the collars and gave him a black turtleneck. However, there are still shots where he has the collars, thereby creating an inconsistency in the movie. Originally, the production crew wanted to film the Genesis planet in Hawaii, and this would have given the Genesis planet an open, real-world feel. However, Leonard Nimoy felt that this would make the Genesis planet look too much like Earth, and would not capture the weird alien look he wanted for the planet. For example, in one scene, the Genesis planet would have huge cactus trees covered in snow. Therefore, Nimoy decided that all Genesis scenes would be created in an indoor setting, and this would give the planet that weird alien look Nimoy wanted. And let's face it, filming on a soundstage was much cheaper than going on location to Hawaii. For the scene where Captain Kirk reacts to the death of his son David, Leonard Nimoy cleared the room so that William Shatner was acting by himself. And Leonard Nimoy told William Shatner to take it as far as he wanted to take it.
bastard, you killed my son. Oh. Klingon bastard, you killed my son.
And it's a great scene. It's not only one of the best William Shatner performances in all of Star Trek, it's just an excellent performance by an actor. James Horner was asked to return to score Star Trek III, and he created a score that was sweeping and elegant. James Horner loves what he did for Star Trek III, even better than what he did for Star Trek II. Dame Judith Anderson, the legendary actress in the golden age of Hollywood, who was Mrs. Danvers in Alfred Hitchcock's Rebecca and Menmet in the Ten Commandments, played the Vulcan High Priestess, Talar. And many people were in awe just having her on set. And of course Gene Roddenberry, who was still serving as creative consultant, so Harve Bennett and Leonard Nimoy were obligated to show Gene Roddenberry the script, even though they didn't have to actually listen to Roddenberry's recommendations. So they showed him the script, and of course Roddenberry had his criticisms with the script. Some of Roddenberry's objections included the fact that he felt that the giant space dock would not be practical nor economically viable in the 24th century. He objected to the idea that Starfleet would consider a great ship like the USS Enterprise obsolete. He objected to the idea that the Genesis planet would be considered off limits and thought it might come across like political foolishness. And he really objected to the idea that the Enterprise ship could be operated by only 5 people, making the entire large crew of hundreds seem practically useless. And one of his biggest objections was the idea of Spock being resurrected without a mind, and then have his katra inserted like a computer program, and thought the idea was too simple and clumsy, and thought it warranted more careful thought and writing. Roddenberry also thought that it was inconsistent to the lore of Star Trek that the Vulcan temples and the elites of Vulcan would go through all this trouble to help a half-breed Vulcan like Spock, whom they barely tolerated up to this point. Roddenberry worried that fans would find this too unrealistic. And another criticism that he had was that he worried that the ending of the movie with Spock recognizing Kirk was too much of a weak ending given the epic adventure that the crew had just been on. Well, these complaints were largely ignored. Well, Gene Roddenberry had 3 final criticisms, and he genuinely worried that these 3 flaws in the Star Trek III screenplay could potentially destroy the Star Trek franchise. So 1, he objected to the fact that Scotty could bring down the entire USS Excelsior by removing a couple of lug nuts. 2nd, he felt that the idea of separating and transferring the katra from the body basically made Vulcans immortal. And 3, he felt that it made no sense that there was even a procedure to implant a Vulcan soul into a mortal, temporarily house it there, while the original body is restored and then aged rapidly due to a degenerating Genesis planet, then placing the Vulcan soul back into the body. Gene Roddenberry asked how often this even happened for Vulcans to be able to know how to do that procedure. And really, he actually does have a point. However, we can all thank all of our abilities to suspend disbelief, because most of us, or all of us, were able to enjoy this movie without thinking about those flaws that apparently bothered Gene Roddenberry so much. And it didn't destroy Star Trek after all, but was rather one more brick in the amazing wall of revival that was Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, this film, and Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home that would propel the Star Trek franchise to even new glorious heights. Now, another behind-the-set story is the story of the fire. The back lot next to the Genesis set was caught on fire one day and almost reached the set of Star Trek III and completely burned it to the ground. And this is because the Paramount lot has a lot of old timber and is very, very vulnerable to fires. Well, William Shatner and several crew members got a water hose and sprayed the fire in order to prevent the fire from getting near the set, until the firefighters were able to reach the set and put out the fire. And when asked about it in an interview, William Shatner will undersell his heroics and say that he did it because he didn't want to get behind on filming. However, some witnesses claim that he was very heroic and may have saved the set from preventing the fire from reaching it. Whereas Star Trek II saw the death of Spock, Star Trek III sees the destruction of the Enterprise. And this was a traumatic moment for many of the fans to see the destruction of their favorite ship. And the effect was accomplished by hanging the model upside down and blowing it up. And that way the debris flying downwards would look like it was flying upwards, hence simulating the zero gravity of space. On the Klingon ship, the final surviving Klingon is Maltz, played by John Larroquette. And John Larroquette was fairly unknown during the filming of Star Trek III. He had been a character actor in Sanford and Son, Three's Company, and Fantasy Island, and was a regular in Black Sheep Squadron. At this time, he was probably best known as playing Captain Stillman in the 1981 comedy Stripes. But his next acting job would be as attorney Dan Fielding on the popular sitcom Night Court. And by the time Star Trek III came out, Night Court had already aired, and many fans were happy to recognize their Dan Fielding as the poor captured Klingon molds. Now, there is an interesting theme in this movie that mirrors the themes of Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, and in many ways, it's like an answer to The Wrath of Khan. Spock dies in Wrath of Khan. Search for Spock brings him back. Wrath of Khan introduces Kirk's son David. Search for Spock kills him off. Wrath of Khan creates a paradise planet of Genesis. Search for Spock destroys that planet. Finally, Search for Spock undoes the theme of Wrath of Khan, the theme of man overcoming his sinful nature. And Search for Spock says that man cannot fight Mother Nature. In the end, Leonard Nimoy delivered Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, on time and under budget, impressing Paramount executives. Well, how did this film do? This film was both a critical and commercial success and made on the ultra-low budget of $16 million. It grossed over $76 million in the US, nearly equaling the box office of Star Trek II. And this movie has a lot of fans, and we've heard of the odd number theory, aka the odd numbered curse, the idea that the odd number Star Trek films are bad, whereas the even ones are good. Well, I think most fans will cite this film as the exception to that rule, because this movie is excellent. It's fast-paced, it's exciting, it's well-directed, and it's an operatic film. And it's interesting to note how much this movie has influenced the Star Trek legacy going from here forward. How many elements that were created for this movie ended up influencing the future canon of Star Trek. First, you have the USS Excelsior, which became a huge Star Trek staple. It was created here. The Klingon Bird of Prey, another iconic Star Trek ship, symbolizing the Klingons on screen for decades. And then we also get the USS Grissom, the Oberth-class science vessel, which would later be featured in Star Trek Next Generation as the USS Pegasus and the USS Chilvosky. It'll also be featured in Star Trek Deep Space Nine as the USS Cochrane, as well as several expanded universe novels. And finally, this introduced the samurai-like nature of the Klingon culture, which elevated the Klingons from popular villains to an alien culture that fans actually identified with. Well, after a successful opening weekend, Paramount went to Leonard Nimoy and gave him a blank check to make the fourth Star Trek film and basically said, "Okay, Mr. Nimoy, give us your vision of Star Trek." And of course we know that that's exactly what he did, but that's another story for my next video in the series. So that ends this video. The next video in this series will be Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, and for all the James Bond fans, I'm exploring all the James Bond films starting with Dr. No, going all the way to No Time to Die and beyond. So check out those videos as they're released. I just released a video on Diamonds Are Forever, so please check that video out, and Live and Let Die and The Man with the Golden Gun are next. So that ends this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you had a great time. Welcome to Totally Awesome Films, and in this episode we're going to talk about the 1986 film Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, otherwise known as The One with the Whales. With its lighthearted tone and themes of friendship, teamwork, and fun, its humorous jokes make it a delightful 2 hours of entertainment. It is arguably the greatest Star Trek movie and inarguably the top 2 greatest Star Trek films, possibly second only to Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. And it remained the highest grossing Star Trek film until 23 years later when it was dethroned by Star Trek 2009. It's an infinitely rewatchable classic that actually broke Star Trek out of its niche Trekkie roots and introduced the Enterprise crew to a whole new demographic that had never seen Star Trek before and helped launch a new golden age of Star Trek. Even before the release of Star Trek III, Paramount gave Leonard Nimoy the green light for a sequel. They were so pleased with Search for Spock that they lifted all constraints they put on him during that film and let him do anything he wanted for the fourth movie. They said, "Mr. Nimoy, give us your vision of Star Trek." The first story concept Leonard Nimoy and Harve Bennett toyed with was titled Star Trek IV: The Trial of Kirk. And this would be a continuation of Star Trek III, where the Klingons put Admiral Kirk on trial for the death of Krug and his crew. And while the whole concept was thrown away, we see small glimpses of it at the beginning of the film and in Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. Nimoy and Bennett agreed to do a much lighter tone film without a clear-cut villain, since the last 2 films were very villain-heavy.
You guys like Italian?
No.
Yes.
Yes.
No.
No.
Yes.
No.
Yes. I love Italian. And so do you.
Yes.
Nimoy had a vision for the movie that was no dying, no fighting, no shooting, no photon torpedoes, no phaser blasts, no stereotypical bad guy. He just wanted the audience to have a great time while watching the film. They also wanted to do a time-traveling story. But during pre-production, William Shatner demanded too much money, and it looked like he might not be in the movie. Shatner had a very successful TV series called T.J. Hooker and had a little more leverage to negotiate. As a solution, Harve Bennett considered doing a prequel about the adventures of a young Kirk, Spock, and McCoy as cadets in Starfleet, and could use lesser-known actors. They would eventually do this for Star Trek 2009. Nimoy was not a fan of the idea of retiring the entire Star Trek cast for younger and cheaper actors, and this would cause tensions between Nimoy and Bennett. William Shatner and Paramount finally settled on a salary, and Shatner and Nimoy were both offered $2.5 million to return, and Shatner was given a clause in his contract that allowed him to direct the next film if he wanted to. And William Shatner would accept the offer, but that's another story. Leonard Nimoy was interested in ecology and of extinct animals since reading a book called Biophilia by Harvard biologist E.O. Wilson, and wanted to include an environmental message in his film. Nimoy and Bennett decided to do a time-traveling story that had a message about the ecology. It would be about something we take for granted today, but would be instrumental in saving the future. In the original treatment, a plague would be wiping out humanity, and it could only be cured by a small fish, the snail darter, that would exist in the rainforest of the past. In the future, the rainforest would have been completely destroyed. However, Nimoy and Bennett worried that the image of thousands of people dying by disease would be too depressing and would undermine the fun and humor of the movie. Leonard Nimoy worried that the Enterprise traveling all the way back in time in order to get a tiny fish might be a little underwhelming and anticlimactic for audiences. He came up with a perfect solution. Not a tiny fish, but something much larger, something gigantic. Well, how about a whale? Nimoy got the idea after talking to his friend about the mystery of the songs of humpback whales. He thought the idea of whales and their whale songs could add another layer of intrigue to the story. Well, now it's time to talk about someone who was almost in this movie, Eddie Murphy. Eddie Murphy was a huge Star Trek fan. Remember all those Star Trek references in his original stand-up act? Well, by pre-production of this movie, Eddie Murphy had become the new international phenomenon after 48 Hours and Trading Places, and then in 1984, he rose to superstar status with Beverly Hills Cop. Apparently, Eddie Murphy approached them and asked if he could be in the next Star Trek movie. And executive producer Jeff Katzenberg described it as either the best idea in the world or the worst. Nimoy and Bennett were intrigued and thought that his presence could widen Star Trek's audience. In the original screenplay by Steve Mearson and Patrick Crikes, Eddie Murphy was an eccentric English professor who was obsessed with whales and also believed in aliens. Eddie Murphy's character would help the Enterprise crew navigate the world of 1986 San Francisco and find their whales. His meeting up with the crew would not only have propelled the plot, but also provided much of the comic relief. When the Enterprise arrives in the 20th century and hear whale songs in the middle of San Francisco, this is because Eddie Murphy is playing whale songs to his college English class. Also, Eddie Murphy would have a male friend who was a marine biologist named Dr. Julian Taylor, and a female friend who was a reporter. And there was a humorous scene where Eddie Murphy would get a hold of a phaser and would show it to his buddy, Julian Taylor, or his reporter friend, as proof that aliens exist. Julian, or the female reporter friend, would dismissively throw it on the ground and go to bed, and the cat would paw at the gun and accidentally shoot the furniture. Taylor would wake up in the morning to see much of his living room disintegrated. Murphy would seek out the Enterprise crew in Golden Gate Park and hit the invisible bird of prey and fall in the grass. And after getting Eddie Murphy's help, Admiral Kirk would thank him and beam up alone, but Murphy would grab Kirk's leg and beam up to the ship, and he would travel back with him to the 23rd century. However, Paramount worried about having Eddie Murphy in their Star Trek movie. There were risks of combining their two most lucrative franchises, Star Trek and Eddie Murphy. At worst, it could dilute both brands. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, Eddie Murphy hated the part. He wanted to play a Starfleet officer, not some crazy person.
I was going to be the one that they met when they got to San Francisco, and I was like, no, I want to beam up, be on the ship, so I didn't do it. They had me like talking jive to Spock. Did the same.
He turned down the role and chose to make the Golden Child instead. Therefore, the Eddie Murphy role, the marine biologist part, and the female reporter were combined into one character. Years later, Eddie Murphy regretted turning down this role. Well, as filming date approached, Nimoy and Bennett were not 100% satisfied with the script. They called back an old friend, Nicholas Meyer, who wrote and directed Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, and asked him for help. Bennett and Meyer decided to write the script together. Nicholas Meyer had already done a time travel story, Time After Time, that already took place in San Francisco, and he wanted the movie to take place somewhere else, like Paris. But Paramount refused. Nick Meyer rewrote the 1986 San Francisco scenes that involved much of the fish-out-of-water humor, while Harve Bennett rewrote the future Federation scenes on Vulcan, the probe threatening the Earth, and the final trial scene where Kirk is demoted back to captain. Within 20 days, they had a working script. Nicholas Meyer added much of the humor and social commentary that made it to the screen. They showed it to William Shatner, who offered his own notes, and this also required another round of rewrites. Bennett and Meyer were very careful to have Admiral Kirk be the undisputed leader of the group. Every event or action in this movie had to run through Kirk, who would make a command decision whether to proceed or not. For example, in the scene where Spock suspects the probe's message is the song of humpback whales, he tells Kirk immediately. Then when he has the idea to go into the past to get the whales, rather than suggest it himself, he puts the idea into Kirk's head, who ultimately makes the decision to go into time warp.
We could attempt to find some humpback whales.
You just said there aren't any, except on Earth of the past.
Yes, Doctor. That is exactly what I said.
Well, in that case... Now wait just a damn minute. Spock, start your computations for time warp.
The entire movie is like this, where Kirk makes a decision for everything. Bennett and Meyer also decided to make the role of marine biologist Dr. Julian Taylor be a woman in order to match the several predominant female marine biologists who were making news at the time. They also felt it would be interesting to have a female who was not a love interest to play against William Shatner. For the role of Dr. Julian Taylor, they hired Catherine Hicks and renamed her character Jillian Taylor. Catherine Hicks was born in New York in 1951 and grew up in Scottsdale, Arizona. She attended St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana, and graduated with a degree in English literature. She won a prestigious acting fellowship to Cornell University, where she was a member of the Ithaca Repertory Theater Company, and she graduated Cornell with a Master of Fine Arts degree. Catherine Hicks landed her first major TV role as Dr. Faith Coolidge on the soap opera Ryan's Hope. She then starred in the Bad News Bears TV show, and in 1980, she nabbed the role of Marilyn Monroe in the ABC TV movie Marilyn the Untold Story, where she was nominated for an Emmy Award for Outstanding Lead Actress. She then played Bill Murray's fiancée in the 1984 film The Razor's Edge, and then starred in this movie, which would earn her a Saturn nomination. She would later go on to play the mother, Karen Barkley, in Child's Play, and then she would go on to an 11-year run as the mother on Seventh Heaven. Catherine Hicks is a practicing Roman Catholic, and every year since 1987, the University of Notre Dame gives out the Catherine Hicks Award to a graduating senior who demonstrates outstanding talent in theater. Now, in this movie, Catherine Hicks did an outstanding job. She fits in perfectly as a member of the Star Trek cast, and she's quirky and cute and has a charming innocence.
What is that?
What's wrong?
You have a pocket pager. Are you a doctor?
Plus, she has great chemistry with William Shatner.
What is it? I thought I told you never to call me.
Sorry, Admiral. We just thought you'd like to know. We're beaming them in now.
All right. Tell them phasers on stun. Good luck, Kirk out.
I think she was able to draw out a very funny and likable side of William Shatner that many had never seen before.
Who gets the bad news?
Don't tell me they don't use money in the 23rd century.
Well, we don't.
Now, Catherine Hicks was not a Star Trek fan and intentionally did not watch the Star Trek episodes because she felt that this would help her feel more like an outsider. 1 month before principal filming began, on January 28, 1986, the world saw the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger, which exploded 73 seconds after takeoff, and this movie was dedicated to the crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger. Star Trek IV began filming on February 1986, and most of the filming was done on location in San Francisco. And Leonard Nimoy intentionally chose sites that were famously associated with San Francisco. And this meant that the cast and crew got to be outside. This was the first film in 7 years that was not filmed inside a soundstage, and everyone involved had a great time shooting this movie. Leonard Nimoy would direct the film wearing his white robe and Vulcan ears, then step in front of the camera and act out a few scenes, then go back behind the camera and direct, all while wearing the white robe and Vulcan ears. There was supposed to be a scene on Vulcan where Kirk asked Saavik, "Have you told him yet?" And Saavik would answer, "No, but I'm taking maternity leave from Starfleet." And this was a reference to the fact that Saavik was pregnant with Spock's child after their Pon farr encounter on planet Genesis. And this would explain why Saavik does not accompany the crew back to Earth, and would also explain why Saavik stays with Spock's mother on Vulcan. A powerful probe from far away comes to Earth looking for humpback whales. And the alien probe was designed by ILM, who brought in Ralph McQuarrie to help design the look of the probe. Ralph McQuarrie, the legendary artist who helped create the look of Star Wars. For the look of the probe, they envisioned a cross between a whale and the monolith from 2001, A Space Odyssey. In the original design, the shining spinning antenna was orange, but it ended up looking like a spinning basketball, so they changed it to the color blue. For the sound of the whales, sound editor Mark Mangini asked Leonard Nimoy what he imagined the probe sounding like, and Nimoy made a whoop 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 sound. So Mark Mangini took Leonard Nimoy into a sound studio and recorded him making the whoop 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 sound, and Mangini transformed it into the alien and foreign sounding voice of the probe. For the other ships in this movie, the USS Saratoga was the USS Reliant, and ILM still had the model of Space Dock in storage and just brought it out and used it for this movie. For the time-traveling scene, ILM wanted to create a segment that could showcase the development of CGI, just as the Genesis sequence introduced the world to CGI back in 1982. And this sequence wants to demonstrate CGI morphing technology, where one character morphs into the other. ILM had Ralph McQuarrie envision the sequence, and the team was aware of a company called Cyberware that had pioneered technology where a person could be scanned and a 3D model could be created from that scan, and then the images were morphed from one person to another. In 20th century San Francisco, the crew breaks up into teams to accomplish their individual tasks. Kirk and Spock attempt to locate some humpback whales. Uhura and Chekhov find a nuclear reactor to reconstitute the decaying dilithium crystals. And Bones and Scotty find plexiglass to create a tank to hold the whales, while Sulu finds a helicopter to transport the glass. Now, for the music, Leonard Nimoy wanted James Horner, who composed the music for Wrath of Khan and Search for Spock. However, Horner had other commitments and did not return. Nimoy went to his close friend, Leonard Rosenman, who had already earned 2 Academy Awards for Barry Lyndon and Bound for Glory. And rather than the epic music of Jerry Goldsmith or the intensity of James Horner, Rosenman decided to match the light tone of the movie. The music features a unique opening theme. Then we get a jazz number when the crew explores the streets of San Francisco, a Russian theme when Chekhov outruns the security guards on the Enterprise, and a comedic medley at the hospital where our crew spring Chekhov. After screening the movie to Paramount executives, Paramount sent Harve Bennett a suggestion to have on-screen subtitles translating what the probe was saying, and even recommended that the probe ask, "Where are you?" Leonard Nimoy and Nicholas Meyer were able to push back to the Paramount executives, insisting that including subtitles would ruin the sense of mystery. And eventually the Paramount executives gave in. One of my favorite scenes in the film is where Spock Vulcan nerve pinches an obnoxious punk rocker. And Leonard Nimoy said that this scene was inspired by a real-life incident where Leonard Nimoy was in New York and waiting at a bus stop when he encountered a young punk with a loud stereo who was blasting it so loud that he was annoying everyone on the street. And Leonard vividly remembered thinking to himself, if I were Spock, I'd just nerve pinch the hell out of that guy. And so Nimoy actually got to do it years later in this movie. However, the earlier writers of the first version of the script have claimed that this scene was actually in the first draft of the script, but it took place on a subway rather than a bus. Regardless, the true hero of the scene is Leonard Nimoy's assistant, Kirk Thatcher, who played the part of the punk rocker, and even shaved his own head, got a mohawk, dyed it orange, and bought his own punk clothes. Kirk Thatcher used to be in a band as a teenager, and he wrote the song, I Hate You. Now, originally, Paramount had gotten the license from several new age rock bands like Duran Duran, but Kirk Thatcher told Nimoy, that's not punk, I can write you a punk song and it'll cost you nothing. So he wrote the lyrics, and had sound editor Mark Mangini come up with a simple guitar riff, and Kirk Thatcher performed and recorded the song over the weekend and gave the vocals an English accent to evoke the Sex Pistols. To this day, Kirk Thatcher gets requests from modern-day bands requesting to cover I Hate You. He even came up with the idea to have his unconscious head turn off the stereo. Kirk Thatcher also provided the voice of the computer that quizzes Spock at the beginning of the movie, but the voice was played at high speed. Kirk Thatcher was an ILM employee who was on the team that worked on the ear critter in The Wrath of Khan, and he applied for and got the job as Leonard Nimoy's assistant in this film. And Kirk Thatcher was a die-hard Star Trek fan and was blown away to be working with his idol. Kirk Thatcher was so dedicated and worked so hard on this film that he was promoted to associate producer. And to this day, he is still a working director in Hollywood. He wrote the screenplay for The Muppets Treasure Island and directed 2 Muppet movies, The Muppets Wizard of Oz and The Muppets Christmas Special. And he also produces and directs a kids' TV show called Sid the Science Kid. And in 2022, he played the monster hunter Joe Vaughn in the Marvel show Werewolf by Night. And this is cool. He and Leonard Nimoy remained friends for decades until Nimoy's death in 2015. Kirk Thatcher recalls memories of the Voyage Home, and after a day of shooting, the two would retire to Nimoy's office, and Nimoy would pour himself a large gin and tonic, and the two would chat about life and the future. Another fan favorite scene is where Chekhov and Uhura are on a busy San Francisco street trying to find directions to the naval base in Alameda, where they keep the nuclear vessels. Much of the scene was improvised with extras passing by ignoring our crew. However, one of the bystanders actually answers,
Ooh, I don't know if I know the answer to that. I think it's across the bay, in Alameda.
And Chekhov says in an exhausting and defeated tone,
That's what I said, Alameda. I know that.
But where is Alameda?
This was accidentally improvised when the extra, who was hired as a non-speaking part, accidentally answered Chekhov. And Leonard Nimoy loved the spontaneity and kept the interaction in the final cut. And her story is actually hilarious. Her name is Leila Serracallo, and she was not an actor, but a random pedestrian whose car was towed due to the city clearing cars for this scene. And they offered her a non-speaking part, and she accepted so she could make money and pay for the towing ticket. When we see the shot of the police officer, that was apparently not an extra, but a real San Francisco police officer who was there for crowd control. Now when Uhura and Chekhov find the nuclear vessels,
And Admiral, it is the Enterprise.
And Nimoy had originally wanted to use the real Enterprise, but the ship was out at sea on a mission, and therefore they used the USS Ranger. Now most of the scenes of the whales were actually 4-foot-long animatronic puppets. Nimoy decided to splurge on these puppets, and he spent $1 million, and ILM hired professional marine biologist Peter Fulkins as a consultant in order to get the whales' look and movements to be accurate. The models of George and Gracie were operated by remote control with men outside the tank. And they were so realistic that the U.S. Fishing Authority initially criticized the movie for getting too close to the whales during filming. And they were surprised that these whales were not real, but were robot puppets filmed on a Paramount set. Leonard Nimoy was sad that ILM was not nominated for an Academy Award for the creation of the whales, nor did they receive much recognition despite the brilliance of these robots. And Leonard Nimoy suspected that this was because the animatronic whales looked so good and so convincing that most people, including the Academy, just accepted that they were real whales and had no idea that these were robots created by ILM. And for years after the movie, the animatronic whales toured the country on display for children at museums and multiple aquariums. The final scene where the bird of prey crashes in the San Francisco Bay was filmed on a Paramount lot pool. Leonard Nimoy and his crew used the lot pool, which was being used as a parking lot, and the pool was known as Blue Sky Tank and often referred to as the B Tank, and it had been used for the parting of the Red Sea in the film 10 Commandments and for the TV movie Return to Gilligan's Island. And in 1979, the lot was used without water to film the Vulcan scene in Star Trek The Motion Picture. The pool had not been used in decades, and no one knew how to use the water pump, so Paramount had to call an old technician who had already retired to come in and teach everyone how to operate the pump. 1 million gallons of water was filtered and sterilized and put into the pool, and the water was 3 feet deep. And the scene where Admiral Kirk swims around the bird of prey was actually done by William Shatner, who did all the swimming by himself. And a full-size humpback whale tail was built and operated so it could be slammed in front of the Star Trek crew. And the staff of Paramount would come to the Blue Sky tank during lunch and enjoy the giant swimming pool and dip their feet in the water while eating their lunch. And you want to know something cool? This building here is the Gene Roddenberry building, which was dedicated to him in 1991, months before his death. Now here's a bit of trivia. Everyone knows one of the most famous lines in Star Trek is, "Beam me up, Scotty." And yet Kirk never said this in the TV series. And well, he says it here.
Scotty, beam me up.
And this is the first time in Star Trek history where Kirk actually says these lines. But hold on a minute. Many fans will point out that he technically says,
Scotty, beam me up.
So technically, "Beam me up, Scotty" has yet to be said on screen by William Shatner. At the end of the film, Captain Kirk and his team are assigned to a newly built Enterprise. However, they had damaged the model in the last two movies, and therefore the production team wanted to build a brand new redesign of the Enterprise they could use for subsequent sequels to this movie. However, Leonard Nimoy chose to save money and had the production team fix the original Enterprise, and the team spent 6 weeks fixing it and painting the old model, and it looks fantastic. And once again, Leonard Nimoy delivered the film on time and under budget, and the film was actually made on the ultra-low budget of only $21 million, which was even $1 million less than the original projected budget of $22 million. Upon its release, it was a huge critical and box office success, making $39.6 million in its first week and grossing over $133 million overall. And this film was also a huge critical success and received universal critical acclaim. This movie also had what is known as breakout appeal, because many people who are not Star Trek fans came out to watch this movie, and many of them were converted into Trekkies. The success of this movie was instrumental in getting Roddenberry's second live-action Star Trek series on television, because 1 year later, the world saw the release of Star Trek The Next Generation, which was actually already being taped during the filming of Star Trek IV. When this movie was being released outside the US, it was released under the title The Voyage Home, with Star Trek being removed from the title. And this is because in 1986, Star Trek was not as famous outside the US. And it was a gamble that paid off because The Voyage Home was massively popular outside the US. The Voyage Home was the first Star Trek film to be shown in the Soviet Union and was screened by the World Wildlife Fund on June 26, 1987 in Moscow. And this was to celebrate the banning of whaling. Both Leonard Nimoy and Harve Bennett attended the screening, and they were pleased to see the Russians absolutely loving the movie. And when McCoy says,
"The bureaucratic mentality is the only constant in the universe,"
the Russian audience broke out in applause. And Star Trek was hot, and 1986 would mark the start of the second golden age of Star Trek, a massively successful film. 2 more movies to follow. The Next Generation TV series, followed by a second TV show, Deep Space Nine, and then a third show called Voyager. Furthermore, this film actually brought attention to the plight of the whales who were on the brink of extinction. Greenpeace saw a huge uptick in donations following the release of this movie, and saw huge increases in the interest in the plight of whales, as well as an increase in activism and volunteers who help preserve sea life. This resulted in a decrease of whale hunting throughout the 80s and 90s as the world saw a huge increase in whale watching tourism, which became a multi-billion-dollar industry, dwarfing the whale hunting industry. And in 2016, 30 years after the release of this movie, the humpback whale was removed from the endangered species list. So it looks like Leonard Nimoy may have actually saved the whales after all. With the success of Star Trek IV, a sequel was immediately greenlit. Shatner and Nimoy had a favored nations contract, and whatever one was offered, the other had to be given the same deal, so Paramount had to let William Shatner direct the next movie. And we'll talk about that movie in our next episode. Welcome to Totally Awesome Films. In this episode, we're going to talk about the 1989 film Star Trek V: The Final Frontier.
I know this ship like the back of my hand.
This is the film that took all the goodwill and potential that the studio had from Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home and kind of squandered it. This is the film that created the debate within the Star Trek fandom. Which is worse, Star Trek the Motion Picture or this one?
Yeah, Star Trek V, worse than 1.
Okay, first of all, that's a comparison of quality, not intensity. Secondly, Star Trek 1 is orders of magnitude worse than Star Trek 5.
Are you joking? Star Trek V is the standard against which all badness is measured.
Star Trek V has specific failures in writing and direction, while Star Trek I fails across the board. Art direction, costuming, music, sound editing.
The movie that began the idea of the odd-numbered curse, with poor Star Trek III being unfairly forced into this otherwise shockingly accurate pattern. This is the film that almost destroyed the Star Trek film franchise. And yet, you can't deny that there's something fun and rewatchable about this film. The cast have great chemistry with each other, and we really feel the friendship between Kirk, Spock, and Bones.
Please, Captain. Not in front of the Klingons.
And at the end of the day, we get to go on one more galaxy-spanning adventure with our beloved crew that really seems like a high-budget version of the old Star Trek TV show. This is pure enjoyable Star Trek fun. But you can't ignore the flaws. The story itself is weak, the special effects are terrible, and the final battle between Kirk and God is laughable. And then there's the idea of Sybok being Spock's long-lost brother, which comes out of nowhere, and then goes nowhere. And the idea of God living at the center of the galaxy seems ridiculous and makes the Star Trek universe seem small. And like Star Trek the Motion Picture, the movie does stand out as being separate from the homogeneity of the epic saga that included Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan, Star Trek III The Search for Spock, Star Trek IV The Voyage Home, and Star Trek VI The Undiscovered Country. With the massive success of Star Trek IV The Voyage Home, a fifth Star Trek film was inevitable. However, according to the contract that William Shatner signed, Shatner had the right to direct Star Trek V, and he accepted the job. Now, this was not a surprising decision at that time. William Shatner had successfully directed many episodes of T.J. Hooker, and so the Paramount executives had confidence in Shatner. Shatner also came up with a story idea, and he got his inspiration from watching televangelists. Shatner said that these televangelists were repulsive, strangely horrifying, and yet I became absolutely fascinated. Now remember, this was 1987, and televangelists were heavy in the news. In 1987, Pastor Jim Bakker was accused of sexual misconduct with his church secretary, Jessica Hahn, and in 1988, Jimmy Swaggart had his own scandals. William Shatner began writing the story of his first draft, which was called Star Trek V, The Act of Love. In the first draft of the story, a televangelist character named Czar would kidnap a human, a Klingon, and a Romulan ambassador who were living on a failed paradise planet. Kirk and the Enterprise would go to help, but get overwhelmed by Czar's superior forces, and Spock and McCoy and the rest of the Enterprise crew would get brainwashed by Czar to believe that he was divine. Czar would reveal that he is on a quest to meet God, and Kirk would pretend to follow Czar and travel with him to the God planet, which would be a fiery wasteland. Kirk confronts God, who turns into Satan, and Spock and McCoy would split up in order to escape, but Spock would get captured, and Kirk would go back to rescue Spock from going to hell. However, Harve Bennett worried about making a movie about the existence of God. I mean, this is such a huge topic that you are bound to leave the audience unsatisfied. At best, it was too weighty, and at worst, it could be offensive. Bennett believed that a Star Trek story about God is not really fun, but a story about an alien that thinks it is God could be potentially exciting. Bennett and Shatner changed the God character into an alien pretending to be God. Now, for a screenwriter, they first approached Nicholas Meyer, but when he found out that the story would be about the Enterprise meeting God, he declined. Then Bennett showed William Shatner a screenplay by David Lowery, and Shatner was impressed and hired him. In later drafts, the character of Czar was changed to Sybok, and while writing him, they wanted him to be played by one actor, Sean Connery. And that would have been amazing. You can almost picture him in this movie. Well, they tried to pursue Connery, but apparently they didn't even get close. Now, there are stories that have claimed that Sean Connery was close to signing, but this appears to be completely false. Apparently, they didn't even get so much as a phone call with him. Besides, Sean Connery was busy making Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Later, the planet named Shakari was a pun on Sean Connery. They then considered Max von Sydow, but apparently that also went nowhere. And I have to admit, I can also picture Max von Sydow in this movie. Now, it should also be noted that in the original draft of the screenplay, the character of Czar was much more of a ruthless leader who demanded absolute loyalty from his cult. However, the producers worried that his character resembled too much of the character of Khan Noonien Singh. And so, to understand the original vision that William Shatner and David Lowery had for this movie, we can imagine a character similar to Khan taking over the ship and crew. And that is pretty cool. Also, the original concept for the movie was much more serious and much darker, and it didn't have all the jokes that have now become associated with Star Trek V. The humor itself was mandated by the studio, who felt that Star Trek IV was funny and extremely successful. So in order to be as successful, Star Trek V had to be just as funny. Hence, they made the crew put in a lot of the humor. So William Shatner and David Lowery had to add in a lot of the jokes to their original serious concept. Also in the original script, Spock and McCoy also get brainwashed by Sybok and join his cause. This would pit Captain Kirk all alone on the Enterprise fighting Sybok by himself, who now had Spock on his side against him. Yes, this is a testament to William Shatner's ego, but you can't deny that it would have been a very dramatic story. One man all alone against his entire crew? The audience would wonder, how can Kirk get out of this? And sure enough, people who read the original script have said that the story was much stronger than what we got on screen. Somewhere in an alternate universe, there is another version of Star Trek V: The Final Frontier with a serious tone without any of the stupid corny jokes, and maybe Sean Connery or Max von Sydow playing a ruthless, Khan-like Sybok, where Spock and McCoy join him and Kirk, all alone, has to single-handedly fight everyone. A movie that ends with the Enterprise crew fighting gargoyles and rockmen in a fiery hell-like landscape. I think that movie could have been epic. One day, William Shatner was at home watching TV and saw a play called Lyndon, starring Lawrence Luckinbill, and when Shatner saw him, he said, "That's my guy for Sybok." And Lawrence Luckinbill had a strong stage presence and excellent acting skills, and it also didn't hurt that he looked a little bit like Sean Connery. Lawrence Luckinbill was a professional stage actor and was well respected in Hollywood. He was also the husband of Lucy Arnaz, the daughter of legendary couple Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz. And it was Lucille Ball who helped greenlight the original Star Trek back in 1966. Now the movie would start with Kirk, McCoy, and Spock together on a camping trip, and this was one of the first scenes that Shatner and Lowery wrote and was in the first draft of the screenplay. And Shatner felt that the scene was the heart of the entire movie. These are three men approaching late life. None of the three are married, they have no children, and they have no prospects for love. They have sacrificed their love for the mission and have spent their entire lives together. And all they had was their friendship. And Shatner loved the scene and loved how Nimoy and Kelley acted the scene with him. And he felt that it captured the chemistry of their friendship for the entire Star Trek saga. Now when William Shatner presented his screenplay, both Leonard Nimoy and DeForest Kelley objected to the script. They both felt that Spock and McCoy would never betray Kirk. They refused to be in the movie unless the script was changed, so William Shatner rewrote the story where Spock and McCoy stand by Kirk's side against Sybok. So now you have the two refusing to betray Kirk, but it's now three heroes against one villain, rather than Kirk fighting him all by himself. And while this is probably more true to the character of Spock and McCoy, it is less satisfying dramatically. Suddenly the villain doesn't seem so dangerous, and there's now never a moment where you wonder what Kirk is going to do next. It diluted the story. So without Kirk fighting the entire Enterprise by himself, you're left with a very passive story where you have our Enterprise crew passively going along on Sybok's quest. It weakened the story. Also, there's a question whether Sybok is a villain or an ally. For the first half of the movie, he is the antagonist, and we the audience are rooting against him. However, we never really quite root against him, because Lawrence Luckinbill plays Sybok with such nobility that he never comes across as villainous. I think that's a detriment from a dramatic point of view. However, halfway through the movie, he becomes part of the crew. All aspects of him being the villain are dropped. We're suddenly introduced to a whole new villain, this godlike alien being that had never been properly set up and suddenly appears during the final chapter of the movie. Also in the original script, Spock was not related to Sybok, but simply a Vulcan that Spock admired. However, Leonard Nimoy did not believe that Spock would betray Kirk. He would have just shot Sybok without hesitation in order to disarm him and save the Enterprise. Only a few movies ago, Spock did not hesitate to sacrifice his life to save the ship. Since then, Kirk risked his career, lost his rank, lost his own son, lost his ship in order to rescue Spock. So why would Spock betray Captain Kirk and the whole Enterprise crew now, just for this unknown character? It didn't make much sense. As a solution, they decided to buff up the relationship and make Sybok, Spock's half-brother, to make it a little more believable that he wouldn't shoot him. Well, there were several problems with this addition into Star Trek canon. First, it seemed entirely unbelievable that Spock's father, Sarek, was married before. It was even more unbelievable that Sarek had fathered another child. And if so, why didn't Spock ever mention him? Second, the problem was that the idea of Spock having a half-brother was never explored during the rest of the movie. This idea that Spock had a brother could have been a very interesting concept to pursue in the movie. However, once the half-brother device was used to explain why Spock wouldn't shoot Sybok, it was put away and never explored again. And that is just sloppy writing. It's a violation of Chekhov's half-brother. Gene Roddenberry himself hated this movie and refused to accept that Sarek had another wife before Amanda and another son before Spock. Roddenberry proclaimed that this would eventually be wiped out from Star Trek canon. And you can argue that this was wiped out from Star Trek canon even before the movie was over. Now, in the scene where Sybok brainwashes McCoy and Spock and takes away their pain, we learn that Spock's pain is that his father never accepted him for being half human. And McCoy's pain was that he euthanized his father, who was dying of cancer. Well, Leonard Nimoy did not like his scene because he felt that his character arc had been fully resolved in the last movie when he and his father had their moment at the end of Voyage Home. He thought it was highly ill-conceived that this would currently be Spock's greatest pain, but still, he did agree to do the scene. As for McCoy's greatest pain,
oh my God, don't do this to me.
DeForest Kelley felt very uneasy about doing the scene and worried that this could destroy Leonard McCoy's heroic image. He asked not to do the scene, but William Shatner felt that this scene could be an excellent way to showcase DeForest Kelley's acting ability. Shatner and Lowry added a line in the script where Sybok asks McCoy why he did it, and McCoy answers,
"To preserve his dignity."
And with that one line, DeForest Kelley felt much better about his motivation for euthanizing his father and felt better about doing the scene. Chekhov actor Walter Koenig was very concerned about William Shatner directing this film, because he worried about Shatner changing his character in a way that suited him without regard to the actors. Koenig cited situations in the past where Shatner recommended character changes, and now as director, he would have the power to implement those changes. However, Koenig was shocked to discover that Shatner was a kind and generous director who was very easy to work with. Another Star Trek cast member who expressed concerns was Sulu actor George Takei. Takei and Shatner had a well-known feud and disliked each other.
And the horse you rode in on.
He originally turned down being in Star Trek V. However, Shatner was able to convince George Takei to sign on to his movie. As filming progressed, George Takei was pleasantly surprised how good a director Shatner was, and Takei stated that William Shatner maintained an enthusiastic and creative atmosphere on set. And he said, "Despite our sometimes strained personal history, I found working with Bill surprisingly pleasant." George Takei stated that he developed a new admiration for William Shatner during the filming of this movie. And this feeling was almost unanimous among the crew, with almost everyone stating that William Shatner was kind and generous and created high morale during the filming of Star Trek V. Now, one actor who was not impressed was Scotty actor James Doohan, who felt that William Shatner was an egomaniac and wasn't capable of making a good Star Trek movie. Still, most of the cast had a great time with William Shatner in the director's chair. It appears that William Shatner was an excellent actor's director. Shatner's weaknesses was more in managing the business aspects of directing a large feature film. In order to save money, Shatner and his crew used much of the sets of Star Trek The Next Generation TV series. For example, the corridors, the sick bay were all used directly from the Next Generation set without any changes. The only thing they built from scratch was the new Enterprise bridge, which they'd hoped to use many more times, but unfortunately got to be used only one more time in Star Trek VI. However, despite these cost-saving measures, William Shatner admitted that due to his lack of experience, he spent too much money up front and eventually ran out of money for the final action piece. At the beginning of the film, when Kirk is climbing the mountain on Yosemite, in the original concept, it was supposed to be Mount Rushmore. And in the future, Mount Rushmore would have a fifth president who would have been an African-American woman. However, due to budget constraints, the idea was scrapped. And for the scene where Uhura does a fan dance to distract Sybok's men in order to capture them, well, the idea started when screenwriter David Lowry joked to William Shatner and Harve Bennett that they should have Nichelle Nichols, who was 58 years old at the time and a few years shy of 60, to do a naked fan dance. And apparently this was intended to be a joke to make Shatner and Bennett laugh. Well, to David Lowry's shock, when he said it, they both paused and thought about it, and they both liked the idea, and Shatner said, "That's it." Remember, prior to Star Trek the original series, Nichelle Nichols was a professional singer and dancer, and during the original series, she was a huge sex symbol. And Nichelle Nichols loved the scene and actually performed it nude, although she did claim in an interview that she was wearing a G-string. Well, she had a great time doing the scene, and originally, she even sang the song that Uhura sings. However, her singing was dubbed by another singer, and no one informed Nichols, who found out that her voice had been dubbed over during the premiere of the movie, and she was supposedly very upset when that happened. Now, for the scene where Scotty says, "I know this ship like the back of my hand," and then knocks himself out, James Doohan hated this scene and thought it made his character seem needlessly foolish. Doohan, who usually does the scene in one take, really struggled doing this short scene and apparently had to do the scene dozens and dozens of times before he got it right. One of the many flaws in this movie is the scale of the galaxy. In Star Trek canon, even at maximum warp, it would supposedly take several years to traverse the entire galaxy. In fact, the entire 5-year mission of the Star Trek original series was limited to one tiny fraction of one quadrant of the galaxy. In all the centuries of the Federations, humans have only colonized a small area of the Alpha Quadrant, barely crossing into the Beta Quadrant. The Gamma Quadrant is so far away that the distance is prohibitive to travel without the aid of a wormhole. So if we were to take the internal logic of the Star Trek canon, it would take years at maximum warp to go from the Federation to the center of the galaxy. Furthermore, once at the center of the galaxy, it could take months, maybe years, to traverse just the center portion of the galaxy. However, in this movie, the Enterprise is able to make this journey, which should have taken years, in a matter of hours. And this raised the eyebrows of even the casual of fans. For special effects, William Shatner wanted Industrial Light and Magic, because ILM had done the special effects for Star Trek 2, 3, and 4. However, producers Harve Bennett and Ralph Winter learned that ILM already had 3 other major projects, and this meant that ILM's top team would be busy working on Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Their B team would be working on Ghostbusters 2, and their C team would be working on James Cameron's The Abyss. Star Trek V would get ILM's D team. Ralph Winter and Harve Bennett realized that no one on this D team, the team that would have been assigned to Star Trek V, would have a single person who had worked on any of the previous Star Trek films. So in a fateful decision, Ralph Winter and Harve Bennett decided that this was a wonderful opportunity to save money. And Ralph Winter admitted that during this time, during the pre-production of Star Trek V,
and in hindsight, maybe he had too much exuberance and not enough discernment. Maybe we were smoking our own publicity.
With an air of invincibility, they believed that any other special effects company would be better than ILM's 4th-tier D team. Ralph Winter blames his decision not to use ILM as one of the reasons why this movie failed. Ralph Winter, Harve Bennett, and William Shatner met with many special effects companies, and Shatner chose Associates and Farron, headed by Bran Farron. And Associates and Farron had done the special effects for Little Shop of Horrors, Altered States, The Untouchables, and Dirty Rotten Scoundrels. And he was nominated for an Academy Award for Little Shop of Horrors. Bran Farron was considered an up-and-coming company known for practical effects. He had a good reputation in Hollywood for being creative and coming up with clever out-of-the-box solutions. However, it soon became apparent that this master of practical effects was a poor match for the special effects extravaganza such as Star Trek. And like Robert Abel with Star Trek The Motion Picture, Bran Farron had a lot of great ideas and made a lot of promises, but basically overpromised beyond his capabilities. For one, Bran Farron hated green screen and had never used it before, and it soon became obvious that you can't do a Star Trek movie without green screen. Therefore, Bran Farron had to subcontract another company, Gregory Jane Incorporated and Peter Wallach Enterprises, to do the green screen effects. The first problem came with filming the Enterprise itself, and this was a very fundamental and basic shot. ILM filmed the Enterprise for the last 3 movies, and in fact, if you consider that John Dykstra started Industrial Light and Magic, therefore there was 10 years and 4 films worth of continuity in filming the Enterprise. The same people developed new techniques and technologies over the 10-year span, and they turned it into a practiced art form. And suddenly, that team was gone. A whole new team who had never filmed the Enterprise before was expected to pick up where ILM took off. And Bran Farron's team struggled with even the most simple basic shots of the Enterprise, and that's why the shots of the Enterprise look stale and static. It practically looks amateurish in this movie. To further complicate the situation, when Bran Farron found the model of the Enterprise, he was shocked to see that someone had spray painted half the model in a dull matte gray. It happened between Star Trek 4 and 5 when Universal Studios filmed an attraction called Star Trek Adventure, and during production, the Universal Studios team had difficulty filming the Enterprise due to the iridescent paint, and their quick solution was to paint it with a cheap matte gray colored spray paint, thus ruining this $100,000 model that had been used since the motion picture. And Associates and Farron spent 6 weeks repainting and repairing the model. Bran Farron was way in over his head and was simply incapable of delivering the special effects that Shatner wanted. However, whereas Star Trek the Motion Picture, the Paramount producers were willing to bring in the top guns, Douglas Trumbull and John Dykstra, to come in after they fired Robert Abel in order to deliver top-notch special effects, Paramount did not want to do the same for Star Trek V. And also, unlike Robert Abel, who delivered almost no usable film and had to be fired, Bran Farron was still delivering special effects, albeit not at the level or of the quality that they were used to with ILM. Therefore, they weren't in a situation where they had to fire Bran Farron. So William Shatner, Ralph Winter, and Harve Bennett just had to accept the second-grade special effects that they were getting. For example, Shatner wanted the final scene to be an all-out battle where the crew of the Enterprise would fight an army of angels and demons in a hell-like alien landscape, and this would have required next-level special effects that may have even stretched ILM's abilities. Well, for Bran Farron, there was simply no way. William Shatner described his plan to have a horde of gargoyles first attack the crew, and they would be repelled off by lasers. The second wave would be an army of rock monsters. Well, unfortunately, there was no way to do the gargoyles, so that had to be abandoned. And as for the rock monsters, Farron thought they can actually build that costume. Well, Shatner wanted to have 10 rock monsters, but Paramount said he could only have 1. So he went back and asked for 6 rock monsters, and Paramount said he could only have 1. William Shatner had to settle for 1 rock monster, and 1 Rockman outfit cost $350,000. And it looked like a deformed version of Ben Grimm, the Thing in Marvel's Fantastic Four. And you can see from the test footage that it looked pretty silly. It had an animatronic face where the facial muscles and eyebrows made of styrofoam rock would move and look sinister. However, the eyes looked funny and made the rock monster look goofy. Furthermore, the technicians blew cigarette smoke into the outfit to cause smoke to leak out of the suit, thus creating a smoke effect in order to conceal the latex foam. And after filming the monster in the California desert, William Shatner did not like how the rock monster looked. He did not have the money to reshoot the footage, and he had to drop the idea of the Rockman and settle for a floating cartoon head of God. However, after filming the CGI sequences of the amorphous floating head of God, William Shatner and Bran Farron looked at the footage and they were not pleased. Shatner wanted to redo the CGI and approach Paramount for more money. However, Paramount wanted to cut their losses and denied the request. The footage you see on film was the graphics that Shatner did not like and wanted to reshoot. Now, unfortunately, he had to use it in the final cut of the movie. The scene in Galaxy Quest where Jason Nisbet fights a rock monster is said to be rumored to be an homage to William Shatner's failed concept. The Paramount executives were worried about the production and had an emergency meeting to consider removing William Shatner as the director. They telephoned Nicholas Meyer and asked him if he would be interested in coming in and directing the rest of Star Trek V. However, when Meyer found out that the story was about the search for God, Nicholas Meyer passed on directing. Ultimately, Paramount decided to keep William Shatner, but refused any requests for more money. Paramount was just trying to cut their losses at this point. After completion of principal photography, William Shatner went to work on editing and produced his final cut of the movie in record time. He turned in his final cut to Harve Bennett and his team, and Harve Bennett and Ralph Winter were a little worried because it really wasn't possible to edit a movie that fast. Well, Bennett's fears were completely justified because the version Shatner turned in was a complete mess. The cut did not make any sense and could not be followed narratively. The special effects looked terrible, and the producers assumed they were seeing special effects test footage, and they were horrified to learn that the special effects they were given was indeed the final product. Harve Bennett knew they were in trouble. So their first solution was to hire famed music composer Jerry Goldsmith, who had composed Star Trek the Motion Picture, and they hoped an excellent score might help the movie. And Jerry Goldsmith turned in an incredible score, and many fans feel that the music in Star Trek V may be the best score among all the Star Trek movies. However, it did not help the story. So Harve Bennett completely re-edited the movie by himself. He had to completely rework the movie and even added a few scenes. One added scene was on the Klingon Bird of Prey, where it is revealed to Kirk that Spock was the gunner who saved him. This was in the original cut of the story and in the first draft of the script, but it didn't make any sense how Spock got on the Klingon bird of prey.
Please, Captain. Not in front of the Klingons.
So Harve Bennett added a scene where we see the Klingon ambassador tell Claw to apologize to Kirk.
I apologize.
And this would show that the Klingon ambassador still had some power and that it was likely he who engineered the temporary peace between the Enterprise and the Klingons and got Spock on the bird of prey. To Harve Bennett's credit, he was able to edit the film into a coherent narrative that we saw on the big screen. However, everyone at Paramount knew they had a very weak movie and held their breath on opening weekend. The movie had a budget of $33 million, which was 50% more than the $21 million of the previous Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home. Well, to everyone's surprise, Star Trek V did very well on opening weekend, making $17.3 million, and it even beat The Voyage Home's opening weekend. However, like all critically panned movies, it had a sharp 59% drop in its second week, and then went on to have the shortest wide release of any of the previous Star Trek films. Now that said, Star Trek V did have a lot of competition at the cinema. The summer blockbuster season of 1989 was incredibly dense. Star Trek V: The Final Frontier had to compete with Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Ghostbusters 2, Lethal Weapon 2, James Bond's License to Kill, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, When Harry Met Sally, and the blockbuster behemoth that was known as Tim Burton's 1989 film, Batman. In the end, it only made $49 million domestically and $63 million worldwide, barely recouping its $33 million budget. It was considered the biggest box office disappointment of the year. And meanwhile, the negative reviews kept pouring in. Most critics thought it was bad, while some critics called it mediocre at best. Some liked the humor, while others found it inconsistent, and most agreed it was a disappointment. As a final insult, this movie is the only Star Trek film to be nominated for a Golden Raspberry Award for Worst Picture, which it actually won. And in the end, The Final Frontier was labeled a commercial and critical failure, and for a while it looked like Star Trek V had just killed the entire franchise on film. Fortunately, Paramount executives did not want to end Star Trek on this movie, and they felt they had to make one more movie in order to cleanse the palate of this film. During Star Trek IV, when it looked like Shatner would not sign on, Harve Bennett wanted to do a Star Trek prequel movie about the original characters during their time at Starfleet Academy. And this had the advantage of using a new, younger cast, but it produced a rift between Harve Bennett and Leonard Nimoy. After this movie, the original Star Trek cast was considered finished, and producers decided that it may be time to put the cast out to pasture. The producers of Paramount approached Harve Bennett and greenlit his Starfleet Academy idea. Fortunately for the original cast, and unfortunately for Harve Bennett, the 25th anniversary of Star Trek was approaching, and Paramount felt that fans might want to see the original cast one more time before saying goodbye, and they thought they could squeeze out one more film with the beloved original cast. Star Trek VI would close the franchise, but that is another story. Well, that ends this video. And if you like learning about the behind the scenes of Star Trek V: The Final Frontier, check out my other videos on Star Trek: The Motion Picture, Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, Star Trek III: The Search for Spock, and Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home. Also, if you like the James Bond franchise, check out my videos on Dr. No, Goldfinger, On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and Diamonds Are Forever. Well, that ends this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you had a great time. In this video, we're going to talk about the 1991 film Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country, where the original crew gets one last chance to make a Star Trek movie that is worthy enough to close out the entire Star Trek film franchise. A film that effectively got rid of the bad taste that Star Trek V: The Final Frontier left with the fan base. A fitting conclusion and tribute to the cast and crew that lovingly embodied these iconic characters for 6 films spanning 25 years. A film that was as much made for the original cast as it was for us, the fans. After the critical and financial disaster of Star Trek V: The Final Frontier, it was assumed that the original Star Trek franchise was over. Paramount gave Harve Bennett the green light to reboot the Star Trek franchise and produce a Starfleet Academy prequel movie using younger actors to play younger versions of the original cast. They considered Ethan Hawke as a young James T. Kirk and John Cusack as Spock, and producers referred to the project jokingly as Top Gun in outer space. The screenplay was written by Harve Bennett and David Lowery, the man who wrote Star Trek V: The Final Frontier, and it was going to be titled Star Trek: The Academy Years. The movie would start with an old Leonard McCoy talking to a group of Starfleet Academy graduates on how he met Kirk and Spock, and it would feature the individual childhoods of Kirk and Spock, and then it would move to the Academy Years where Kirk and Spock would meet Bones McCoy and Montgomery Scott. They would face off against a new villain and then part ways to presumably meet years later on the USS Enterprise. And you can see some similarities as well as differences from the J.J. Abrams' 2009 Star Trek prequel. As you can imagine, this did not go over well with the stars of the original cast, and it created a huge power struggle with Harve Bennett on one side and Shatner, Nimoy, and the rest of the cast on the other. And the situation got very ugly, and even Gene Roddenberry got involved, siding with the original cast. Fortunately for the cast, the 25th anniversary of Star Trek was approaching, and this gave the original stars a little bit of a publicity bump along with some political power. The final factor was Martin S. Davis, who was the CEO of Paramount Pictures' parent company, Paramount Communications, and he was basically Frank Mancuso's boss. And when he found out that the sixth Star Trek movie would not feature the original series cast, he was furious and demanded that the plug be pulled on the Academy Years. He demanded a sixth movie using the original cast. And so, Leonard Nimoy, Gene Roddenberry, and the original series cast ended up winning the power struggle, and poor Harve Bennett lost. Paramount head Frank Mancuso Sr., who had reluctantly greenlit Star Trek: The Academy Years, was forced to side against Harve Bennett, thus ending an epic 10-year relationship between Bennett and Star Trek. And Bennett felt very betrayed by Paramount since he was responsible for the success of Star Trek II, Star Trek III, IV, and V, and he had single-handedly ushered in the golden age of the Star Trek film franchise, and now he was out. With Harve Bennett gone, Paramount began to develop the final swan song for the original Star Trek cast, a fitting goodbye to the cast and characters that had served the fans for 25 years. Chekhov actor Walter Koenig came up with the idea titled In Flanders Field, which is a reference to the World War I poem, and in the movie, the Federation joins the Romulans to fight the Klingons in an all-out war. The three would then join together to fight a race of powerful, worm-like aliens. And it was rumored in the script that everyone except Dr. McCoy and Spock would die. Unfortunately, it was determined that this film was way too dark to close out the Star Trek film franchise. Now, Frank Mancuso and the producers asked themselves who had benefited the Star Trek franchise the most. And two names came up: Leonard Nimoy, who directed Star Trek III and IV, and Nicholas Meyer, who wrote and directed Star Trek II and wrote half of Star Trek IV. Leonard Nimoy was made executive producer for Star Trek VI, and Nicholas Meyer was brought in for story ideas. Initially, Paramount asked Leonard Nimoy to direct, but Nimoy immediately refused, because Nimoy did not want to direct, as he felt that if he did, William Shatner would have been jealous, and Nimoy did not want to risk him getting upset and refusing to be in the movie, which would have basically ruined any chance of a sixth Star Trek film. Paramount then hired two screenwriters, Lawrence Connor and Mark Rosenthal, to work with Leonard Nimoy and write the screenplay. Lawrence Connor and Mark Rosenthal were a famous screenwriting team who had written for Little House on the Prairie, Remington Steele, and wrote the screenplay for Jewel of the Nile and Superman 4: The Quest for Peace. And their original idea was to have the original series crew meet Jean-Luc Picard and Data, and this idea was immediately canceled. Leonard Nimoy then went to Nicholas Meyer's house and the two started brainstorming. Leonard Nimoy apparently said, "What if the wall came down in outer space? After all, the Klingons have always been the stand-ins for the Russians, and the Berlin Wall had fallen a year earlier." Then Meyer replied, "Okay, we start with an intergalactic Chernobyl, a big explosion, and we got no more Klingon Empire." The two decided to make a movie, a deliberate story about the contemporary political climate between the US and Russia. Chernobyl was a catastrophic nuclear accident that occurred in the Soviet Union on April 26, 1986, when a nuclear power plant exploded, and it is considered the single worst nuclear accident in history. It added to the economic strain to a struggling Soviet economy, as well as strengthening the mistrust of the world. It also exacerbated the mistrust that the Russian people had of its own Soviet government. Chernobyl is generally considered among historians to be the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. On June 13, 1990, the Berlin Wall was officially disbanded, and in December 26, 1991, a few months after the release of this movie, the Soviet Union formally disbanded and ceased to exist. Leonard Nimoy hired Nicholas Meyer to write the screenplay since Meyer was familiar with Star Trek and Nimoy knew that he could write fast. He had written Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan in 12 days and had revised the script for Star Trek IV in less than 20 days. And Nick Meyer wanted to do something different for Star Trek VI. He didn't want to do a hero versus villain story like Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan, and he didn't want to do a comedy like Star Trek IV The Voyage Home. Nicholas Meyer wanted to write a movie that was an ensemble piece as well as a political thriller. While Nicholas Meyer was busy writing the screenplay, the original screenwriters, Lawrence Konner and Mark Rosenthal, were also busy writing their screenplay about the Federation and Klingons creating a peace. And when Nicholas Meyer found out about this, he was confused and upset. However, Konner and Lawrence produced very little usable story elements, and eventually Leonard Nimoy fired Konner and Rosenthal, although the two took Nimoy and Meyer to arbitration and got story credit for Star Trek VI. However, almost all of what we saw on screen was directly written by Nicholas Meyer and his friend, Danny Martin Flynn. Nicholas Meyer and Danny Martin Flynn turned in their completed script for Star Trek VI, and Paramount loved it and greenlit the movie. Leonard also suggested that Meyer direct the film since there was no way he could direct, and Nicholas Meyer's own wife encouraged him to direct the movie. Nicholas Meyer was very excited to direct Star Trek VI. He had just directed a movie called Company Business and had a terrible experience. Company Business was a film starring Gene Hackman and Mikhail Baryshnikov, and it received negative reviews and made on a budget of $18 million. It only made $1.5 million at the box office. And he was eager to direct something he was familiar with to get the bad taste of Company Business out of his mouth. Here's something really interesting. In the original script, Nicholas Meyer wanted to establish a little introduction that a certain passage of time had passed in Star Trek V. There would have been individual vignettes about each of the original cast. Captain Kirk would be with Carol Marcus and would be living happily ever after on his farm until a Starfleet officer would come to his door and Kirk would be escorted to help the envoys gather the original crew and bring them out of retirement. The next scene would go to Spock, who has retired from Starfleet and is now a Vulcan actor. He would be playing Polonius in a Vulcan version of Hamlet, obviously a play on Leonard Nimoy's own life as a classic Shakespearean actor. Leonard McCoy would be introduced, bored and getting drunk at a posh, high-class dinner for wealthy retired physicians. And Chekhov would be in a bar playing chess and losing to an alien. After collecting Chekhov, Kirk would tell him, "You realize that all betazoids are psychic." And Chekhov would be shocked and incredulous and would say, "I was robbed." Uhura would be a host in a call-in radio show and would be bored at her job and would be very happy to see Kirk. Montgomery Scott would be a Starfleet engineering professor lecturing in a large auditorium about the cloaking technology of the Klingon bird of prey, and he would be dismantling the Klingon bird of prey from Star Trek 3 and 4 in front of a large audience of students. The biggest difference would have been Sulu, who was not the captain of the Excelsior, but a taxicab driver in a busy futuristic metropolis. However, in a second script, they decided to change Sulu from a taxicab driver to Captain Sulu, and he, not Kirk, was going to go around gathering the original crew. Unfortunately, Leonard Nimoy and Nicholas Meyer had to abandon this idea, mostly due to budgetary reasons. After analyzing these scenes, they realized that they would have had to film in different locations and create new sets. The cost was estimated at an additional $10 million. And while fun, it would have been way too expensive without adding anything to the plot. Meyer and Flynn tried every which way to hold on to that opening, but Paramount threatened to cancel the film unless the budget was slashed, which meant the opening sequence had to go. The idea had to be discarded. They abandoned the opening sequence and came up with a new scene where Captain Sulu would have his own starship, the USS Excelsior, and his own 5-year mission. And this would also be a really cool callback to the ending of Star Trek IV The Voyage Home, when the crew wonders which ship they'll be assigned to and Sulu says,
"I'm counting on Excelsior."
Well, it appears he got his dream command. It would be Captain Sulu who had witnessed the Klingon Chernobyl explosion. Here Sulu says his 5-year mission was cataloging gaseous anomalies. And this was a setup which would have paid off at the end of the movie when Sulu has the idea that the cloaked bird of prey expels gas, and therefore his ship has the equipment to modify a torpedo that would track the cloaked Klingon bird of prey by detecting the ship's expelled gases. However, William Shatner wanted his Enterprise crew to come up with the idea, so it was changed in the script. For the movie, Nimoy and Meyer decided the movie should have a Gorbachev-like character and created Gorkon. And Gorkon was based on Gorbachev, but also Gandhi and Abraham Lincoln, and his name would be a mixture of Gorbachev and Lincoln, Gorkon. In the script, Saavik would return, and she was supposed to betray the Enterprise and Kirk. Roddenberry read the script, and he hated this and objected. First, he was upset that he would turn Saavik, a fan-favorite character, into a villain, and second, Gene Roddenberry objected to the fact that Kirk and his crew are racist and bigoted toward the Klingons. He believed that bigotry would eventually disappear from the 23rd century and did not want such bigotry depicted in his future universe. Roddenberry and Meyer had yelling matches, with Meyer storming out of Roddenberry's office. The studio ignored Roddenberry and went ahead with Nick Meyer's idea. However, due to Gene Roddenberry's position as creative consultant, Meyer was obligated to show him cuts of the film. They continued to have ugly arguments throughout the filming of the movie, and Roddenberry was 70 years old and was in bad health for someone who was fairly young at only 71 years old. Well, he died 48 hours after seeing the final cut of this film. And Meyer never realized how sick Roddenberry was and always felt guilty for the way they argued in the last few months before his death. And when the film was released in theaters, it was dedicated to Gene Roddenberry. DeForest Kelley, who played Bones McCoy, was also 71 years old and was also in pretty bad health and had considered retiring before the film. However, Paramount offered to pay him $1 million to be in it, and DeForest Kelley decided to sign on for one more film in order to have more money to leave his family. Nick Meyer had Christopher Plummer in mind when he wrote General Chang, and he had to personally go to Christopher Plummer and convince him to do it. Plummer was friends with William Shatner and was excited to get to work opposite him. Originally, Christopher Plummer was supposed to have a full head of Klingon hair, but while putting on the makeup, he liked the look of the bald Klingon and asked if General Chang could remain bald, and Meyer agreed, and the bald look of General Chang was born. And to complete the look, they added an eye patch that is bolted to a skull. Meyer originally wanted Jack Palance to play the Klingon Chancellor Gorkon, but Palance had to turn down the role to finish up City Slickers. David Warner, who had just played the Earth Ambassador in Star Trek V, ended up winning the role. And when they applied the Klingon makeup to Warner, the artist intentionally made him look like a cross between Abraham Lincoln and Captain Ahab from Moby Dick. They even gave him a walking stick like Captain Ahab, although it had a distinct Klingon twist. During the dinner scene in the movie, Chancellor Gorkon says,
"You have not experienced Shakespeare until you have read him in the original Klingon."
And I thought this was a hilarious line at the time, but fine. Two members of the Klingon Language Institute, Nick Nicholas and Andrew Strader, actually translated the entire play of Hamlet into the Klingon language and published it through Pocket Books. At the opening of this movie, when Captain Sulu observes the planet Praxis exploding, we see a shockwave ring explode outwards, and effects were done by Industrial Light and Magic, and they decided to try something new that had never been seen before on screen, and it would indicate the explosion's massive size compared to the tiny starship. And they decided to put in this explosion ring, which would dwarf the giant starship, giving the planetary explosion its scale. And the wave also serves a story in that it causes destruction in its wake, and Captain Sulu has to solve this problem by steering the ship into the wave, thereby showing us his experience and really what he's made of as captain. This shockwave ring was the first time something like this had ever been put on film, and hereafter this effect is going to be known as the Praxis effect. The Praxis effect would be used again and again in Hollywood anytime the filmmakers wanted to depict a huge explosion. It would be used 3 years later in Stargate and used again in 1996 in Independence Day. And it was used again in 1998 in Armageddon, and most memorably used twice in the Star Wars special editions. George Lucas, who owned ILM, used the Praxis effect for both the destruction of the Death Stars in Star Wars A New Hope and again in Return of the Jedi. The Praxis effect has now become a kind of cliche anytime there's a planetary explosion. However, the Praxis effect, while looking visually cool, is probably scientifically inaccurate. Expert astronomers have stated that if there were a huge explosion in space, the shockwave would likely go out spherically in all directions, not in a two-dimensional ring. In the original script, the part of Lieutenant Valeris was supposed to be Lieutenant Savick. They first approached Kirstie Alley, who was busy filming Cheers, and declined to be in it. Robin Curtis was not approached. And then they approached Kim Cattrall, who had been the original choice to play Savick in Star Trek II. She turned it down, saying that she did not want to be the third actress to play the same character. Therefore, Nicholas Meyer, who really wanted Kim Cattrall in this role, rewrote her as a new character, Lieutenant Valeris. Apparently, Kim Cattrall named the character herself after Eris, the Roman goddess of strife. And Kim Cattrall was already famous for a breakout role as Honeywell in the 1982 film Porky's, and by 1991, her three most famous roles were Gracie Law in Big Trouble in Little China, the titular role in Mannequin, and Karen Thompson in Police Academy. However, it would be another 5 years until her iconic role as Samantha on Sex and the City. Star Trek VI had several themes running through it. The first was the analogy of the Cold War ending and the Iron Curtain coming down in space. The second was that of racism. The Iron Curtain analogy worked well because the Klingons were always the stand-ins for the Soviet Union, as well as the expansionism of the old Mongol Empire, with a little China thrown in. Ironically, it was the addition of the Japanese samurai warrior code into the Klingon culture in Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, that resonated most with the Star Trek fans and elevated the Klingons from enemies of the Federation to a fan-favorite culture that rivaled the Federation in terms of popularity. By 1991, Klingon culture was being revered by fans due to the Next Generation TV series, where the Klingons and the Federation had been at peace for over 70 years. And by 1991, fans were dressing up as the Klingons for conventions and learning how to speak the language. They were no longer the villains. And so the idea is that this film would bridge the events of the Star Trek film franchise, where the Federation and Klingons were enemies, to some point sometime 70 years in the future, where the Klingons are allies with the Federation. We learn that Spock has been working with the Klingon ambassador to negotiate a peace, and Nimoy has volunteered the Enterprise crew to escort the Klingon ambassador to peace talks at Camp Khitomer. And Captain Kirk, who spent his entire life fighting the Klingons, and who had his own son killed by the Klingons in Star Trek III, cannot forgive the Klingons and cannot imagine a world where the Federation and the Klingons are allies. In the scene where Spock says,
"They are dying,"
Kirk answers, "Let them die." And as originally filmed, after Kirk says let them die, he looked shocked by what had just come out of his mouth, and he looked embarrassed and ashamed at the hate that had just come out of him. And this made him much less racist and bigoted toward the Klingons. However, for the final print of the movie, Nicholas Meyer cut this out, and so we get Kurt saying, "Let them die," and it just cuts to Nimoy being shocked. And this made his character seem much more intolerant and racist, and William Shatner was apparently very upset that Meyer edited out his shocked reaction. The Enterprise meets the Klingons, and we see the immense Klingon battlecruiser. And it's the first time we've seen this ship since their brief introduction at the beginning of Star Trek The Motion Picture. And in keeping with the racism motif, Nicholas Meyer sprinkled more callbacks and references to racism in Hollywood movies. In fact, the line, "Guess who's coming to dinner?" is a reference to Sidney Poitier, the story about a black man going to meet his white girlfriend's parents. And it was supposed to be spoken by Nichelle Nichols, but fortunately, she refused to read the line, and it was read by Walter Koenig,
"Guess who's coming to dinner?"
thereby diffusing the racial tension of the line. There was another line by Uhura where she says, "Yeah, but would you want one of them marrying your daughter?" And thankfully, Nichelle Nichols refused to say this line, and the line was dropped. For the dinner, the food was squid dyed blue, and other foods dyed purple, and this gave the meal a very alien look. None of the cast wanted to eat the odd blue food, especially after it sat underneath the hot lights for hours. So director Nicholas Meyer offered $20 cash to anyone who ate the food in front of a camera, and William Shatner happily obliged, eating the blue squid with gusto. During the assassination scene, the Klingon blood is shown to be pinkish purple. In the Next Generation TV show, Klingon blood has always been red. However, having a blood red massacre would have ensured an R rating. By having the blood be pinkish, it assured a PG-13 rating. And the pink blood was supposed to outline the differences between the anatomies of the humans and the Klingons, making McCoy's inability to save the Chancellor Gorkon more understandable and sympathetic. However, the pink blood of the Klingons did not stay in canon long, and Klingon blood reverted back to red after this film. Even by the next movie, Star Trek Generations, Klingon blood was once again shown to be red. This film also utilized CGI to depict the anti-gravity scene where we see pink blood floating in space. And this is one of the first times something like this had been put on film. And it worked very well and really took advantage of this new medium of computer-generated special effects. When Kirk and McCoy are captured, they're taken to a Klingon trial. In the original concept for the scene, Leonard Nimoy and Nicholas Meyer really wanted to showcase the Klingon homeworld, Kronos, for the first time. And this would have been a huge deal for the Star Trek canon. Unfortunately, this would have been very expensive to film. So instead, Leonard Nimoy and Meyer chose a much cheaper and cost-saving option to only depict the trial in the courtroom and then move to the prison planet. At the trial, the attorney for the defendants is Colonel Worf, played by Michael Dorn, who is supposed to be the great-grandfather of Worf from the Next Generation TV show. And for the Klingon court, the production team created the illusion of an endless mass of hundreds of Klingons by using good old-fashioned Hollywood practical special effects creativity. In the front row closest to the camera, there were 6 actors playing Klingons, all wearing full Klingon makeup. In the next row, there were 15 Klingon actors wearing more simple makeup, while the dozens of actors behind them wore inexpensive Klingon masks. And behind them, the production team purchased 200 commercially available Worf action figures and had them rocking back and forth using sticks and tiny motors. Rather than the planet homeworld of Kronos, we get Rura Penthe, the prison planet that is perpetually covered in freezing snow. And for the interior shots inside the penal colony, most of the scenes were shot on a Paramount soundstage, and this necessitated the use of artificial plastic white powder to resemble snow. And apparently this plastic snow got into everything, and the cast and crew were cleaning fake snow from their shoes and socks weeks after shooting the scenes. The entrance of the penal colony was shot inside a large cave in Griffith Park in Bronson Canyon in an old abandoned mine. Only the entrance of the cave was used for filming, but was filmed at night to give the illusion that they were deep inside the caves. For the exterior shots of Rura Penthe, when Kirk, McCoy, and Martia travel across the planet, the production team found a huge glacier in Anchorage, Alaska. And this was not an easy sequence to film. This site was not accessible by road and was only gotten to by helicopter. And a second unit team of stuntmen playing the 3 actors flew to the site for filming. And the site was very cold, often reaching negative 50 degrees. And for filming, the stuntmen could only wear wool clothing seen in the movie, causing them to almost contract pneumonia. At the prison colony, Kirk and McCoy befriends a shapeshifter named Martia, played by supermodel Iman, and Martia will help them escape, although this will turn out to be a setup. During the events of the movie, Martia shapeshifts into a large male alien named Brute, a young child, and a copy of Kirk, and it is implied that Brute is the natural form of Martia. So I was curious, is Martia's species the same as the shapeshifters from Deep Space Nine? And the answer is no. The shapeshifters in Deep Space Nine are called changelings, who have created a vast empire known as the Dominion, and they rule the Gamma Quadrant. Changelings are incredibly intelligent beings who are skilled at understanding politics, and one changeling can often disrupt an entire planet's political system. They're brilliant and devious. Furthermore, changelings are able to transform their bodies into anything from humanoid forms to other life forms and even to amorphous blob-like shapes. Martia, on the other hand, comes from beings known as cameloids. And cameloids are only able to shapeshift into humanoid forms and often retain their distinct yellow eyes whenever they shapeshift. Furthermore, they do not have the mind for organized politics and are often seen associating with the seedy criminal element of the galaxy. In the Star Trek canon, Martia was the only cameloid to be depicted in the official Star Wars canon until recently, where Star Trek Section 31 depicted another cameloid named Quasi, played by Sam Richardson. Now, on board the USS Excelsior, Captain Sulu gets a message from Starfleet to assist in the capture of Kirk. And the bringer of this message is a Starfleet officer played by Christian Slater. And Christian Slater was a huge Star Trek fan growing up, and his mother was Mary Jo Slater, who was the casting director for Star Trek VI. He begged his mother to put him in the movie as a small cameo, which she did. And at that time, Christian Slater had broken out in the 1988 film Heathers and the 1990 film Pump Up the Volume and Young Guns 2, and had memorable roles in the 1991 film Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves and Mobsters. And at this time, he was a huge star on the rise. Christian Slater received the minimum scale payment of $750 for his cameo in Star Trek VI, and he never cashed the check, and got the check framed and has it displayed on his wall to this day. After discovering that Valeris has betrayed him, Spock is sulking in his room where Kirk comes in to check in on him, and he says,
"Is it possible that we two, you and I, have grown so old and so inflexible, have outlived our usefulness?"
And this line's subtext is clearly referring to the fact that William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy have gotten so old that they can no longer effectively play their Star Trek characters. And Leonard Nimoy said that while performing this line, he began to choke up and he really struggled to film this scene. Now, after the original Star Trek team has saved the galaxy one last time, after 25 years, Meyer wanted to leave them with a perfect screenshot that resembled a curtain call. And this is a nice, touching scene, and what a gift to give the original cast. On board their respective ships, Captain Sulu and Captain Kirk officially say goodbye, and the movie ended with a quote from Peter Pan, and this symbolized the original cast's desire to remain young and play Star Trek forever. Originally, the idea was to have the actors sign off as their characters, and it was a unique idea. However, it was later decided that the actors would just sign off as themselves. Well, how did this movie do? It was made on a budget of $27 million, which was considerably cheaper than Star Trek V. It made $97 million at the box office, and it was also a critical darling with mostly positive reviews. Critics thought that this was a huge improvement over The Final Frontier, and fans felt better about the original cast leaving on this note rather than on the disastrous Star Trek V. The Undiscovered Country was nominated for 2 Academy Awards and won the Saturn Award for Best Science Fiction Film, and after this movie, numerous expanded Star Trek universe novelists began to write fan fiction starring Captain Sulu. It turns out that an Excelsior TV show was actually being considered. And in 1996, in the 3rd season of Voyager, in the episode Flashback, George Takei reprised his role as Captain Sulu on the USS Excelsior. And this was planned as a possible backdoor pilot to pitch an Excelsior TV series. A few years later, when Deep Space Nine had finished and was off the air, and Star Trek Insurrection had just bombed at the box office, with the ratings for the last few seasons of Voyager slipping, Paramount wanted to do another Star Trek series to pump some new life into the Star Trek franchise, and one of the ideas considered was an Excelsior series starring George Takei as Captain Sulu. And in the spring of 2000, thousands of Star Trek fans, including the organization called the International Federation of Trekkers, a fan organization of over 5,000 members, encouraged Star Trek fans to write into Paramount showing their support for a Captain Sulu TV series. They were joined by numerous fan groups, including the Media Action Network for Asian Americans, who also wanted a TV show that had a positive depiction of Asian Americans in the media. However, on May 11, 2001, Paramount and Star Trek producer Rick Berman announced the new Star Trek series was going to be called Enterprise, and it would be a prequel about the first voyage of 1701. Many fans, including George Takei, were very disappointed. Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country was a worthy conclusion to 12 years of the original cast on film and serving the fans for a total of 25 years. It was a fun movie that allowed the entire cast to retire with dignity and grace. Now, the next Star Trek video will focus on transitioning the franchise over to the next generation, and we'll talk about how that film did in the next episode. But for the next video, we'll be doing the series on Rocky and then return to James Bond before we return to Star Trek: The Next Generation. Well, that ends this video. If you enjoyed this video, check out my other videos, including the videos on the entire Star Trek Next Generation franchise, as well as my videos on the Sean Connery James Bond films. That ends this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you had a great time.